Hey there, night owls. You know Daniel from one scene. The guy tossed in with a den of hungry lions, the Sunday school poster we all colored in as kids. Cute story. But that lion pit, barely a footnote. The real Daniel handed us a full map of how the whole world ends, and most of us walked right past it. Here's the strange part. When God wanted to reveal the final chapter of history, he skipped the heavyweights. No Isaiah, no Jeremiah. He handed the blueprint to a captured teenager in enemy territory. And that is what this Connection series does. One Old Testament book, every hidden bridge running straight into Revelation. Tonight, I am giving you 15 connections and one secret pattern buried in this book. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Trust me, it changes everything. So smash that like button and drop me a comment. What city are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Let me know who is rolling with me. All right, let us dive in. So let us start with the most obvious question of all. If this book is such a heavyweight, if it really does hand us the blueprint for how everything wraps up, then why does hardly anyone actually sit down and read it? Why does Daniel gather dust on the shelf while people flip straight to the flashy monsters and trumpets over in Revelation? The answer, it turns out, is not that Daniel is dull. The answer is that Daniel is strange. Gloriously, spectacularly strange. And strange books, unfortunately, tend to get politely set aside. Here's the thing. When you picture an Old Testament prophet, you probably imagine a wild-eyed man in a rough cloak, standing on a dusty street corner, jabbing a bony finger at the crowd and thundering about repentance. That is the standard model. That is more or less what Isaiah does, what Jeremiah does, what most of the prophetic lineup does. They march in, they call out the sins of the nation, they warn about what is coming, they occasionally weep about it, and then they go home. It is powerful, it is poetic, and it is reasonably easy to follow along, even if the message is deeply uncomfortable. You always know where you stand with a classic prophet. Usually the answer is in trouble, but at least it is clear. Daniel does almost none of that. Daniel belongs to a completely different literary species, one with a rather intimidating name, apocalyptic. Now, the word apocalyptic has picked up a lot of baggage over the centuries. Say it at a dinner party, and people immediately think of asteroids and mushroom clouds and the general end of the world. But the original idea is far simpler and, frankly, far more interesting. Apocalyptic literature is the genre of unveiling, of pulling back a curtain to show you something normally hidden from human eyes. Instead of a preacher shouting on a corner, you get sweeping visions in the dead of night. Instead of tidy moral lessons, you get bizarre composite beasts crawling out of the sea. Instead of the prophet simply telling you what God said, you get a baffled human being who has to have an angel stand beside him and patiently explain what on earth he just watched, which naturally is a genre that asks a bit more of the reader. You cannot skim it, you have to lean in. And leaning in reveals a whole toolkit the classic prophets almost never reach for. In this genre, dreams do the heavy lifting, and a single dream can hold the compressed history of centuries folded up inside it. Numbers stop being mere quantities and start carrying weight of their own, so that a span of days or years becomes a clue rather than a measurement. Empires do not appear as empires at all, but disguise themselves as animals, a lion here, a bear there, and eventually a creature so dreadful it has no match anywhere in the animal kingdom. And hovering over all of it sits a heavenly courtroom, thrones and books and a judge, as though the messy sprawl of human history were quietly being put on trial in a chamber none of us can see. These are not flaws in the writing, they are the entire point of it. Apocalyptic literature assumes that the real story of the world is bigger than the evening news, that behind the visible clash of kings there is an invisible order slowly working itself out. Reading it is less like sitting through a lecture and more like being handed a stack of aerial photographs and asked to work out the shape of the land below. And the far horizon Daniel keeps staring toward is genuinely vast. This is not a man who forecasts one event and calls it a career. Over the course of the book, he sketches something closer to the entire arc of world history unrolling from his own day. Empire giving way to empire in a long procession, each one rising, dominating, and crumbling more or less on schedule, until the whole sequence bends toward a final resolution. It is an audacious thing to attempt, mapping the future of civilizations centuries before they exist. And it is precisely this breathtaking scope that has made the book both fiercely debated and utterly impossible to ignore. You may argue about the details, but you cannot accuse Daniel of thinking small. He is trying to hand you the shape of everything, from where he stood all the way to the end of the line. And that already sets Daniel apart from the crowd. The other prophets tell you how the nation ought to behave right now. Daniel is far more interested in what is coming later, much later. He is less a street preacher and more a man handed a telescope and pointed toward the far edge of history. The result reads less like a sermon and more like a series of coded dispatches from the future, which is exactly why it feels so different from everything around it, and exactly why a lot of readers quietly give up around the part where a goat with an oversized horn comes charging across the landscape. We will get to that goat eventually. It is worth the wait. There is a second peculiarity, and this one is the kind of detail that historians find delightful, and everyone else usually walks straight past. The book of Daniel is not written in one language, it is written in two. The opening section and the closing section are in Hebrew, the language you would expect from a Jewish exile writing about his own people. But smack in the middle, roughly from the 2nd chapter through the 7th, the text quietly switches over into Aramaic, which was the international language of the ancient Near East. Think of Aramaic as the business tongue of the day, the language of diplomacy, trade, and empire, the sort of thing everyone from Babylon to the ragged edges of the known world could read. It was, more or less, the common speech of the whole neighborhood, and it stayed that way for centuries. Not a bad choice of second language if you have to pick one. Now, an ancient scribe did not just drift between two languages by accident, the way you might switch to your phone mid-conversation because something buzzed. This was a deliberate choice, and the seam where the languages meet is not random at all. Look at what falls inside the Aramaic section, and something rather elegant appears. The middle chapters, the ones written in the shared imperial language, deal with kingdoms, thrones, world powers, and the sweeping fate of nations. They are addressed, in a sense, to everyone, to the whole planet, so they are written in the language the whole planet could actually read. The Hebrew portions, by contrast, feel more intimate, more concerned with the specific destiny of one particular people. In other words, the two languages are not a printing error, they are a signal. When Daniel wants to speak to the world, he uses the world's language. When he wants to speak to his own, he switches back. It is a small architectural touch that tells you the author knew exactly what he was doing, which is rather more than most of us can claim on a good day. The third reason Daniel slips through the cracks is almost administrative, but it matters. In the Hebrew arrangement of the scriptures, the books are sorted into groups, and one of those groups is simply called the prophets. You would assume quite reasonably that a book stuffed with prophetic visions about the future of empires would be filed right there, front and center, alongside the other big names. But it is not. In the Hebrew ordering, Daniel sits in a different section altogether, a sort of catch-all collection known as the writings, tucked in among poetry, wisdom, and history rather than among the thundering prophets. It is a bit like discovering that the most explosive whistleblower file of the century got stuck in the miscellaneous drawer instead of the front office. The placement is not an insult exactly, but it does mean a reader working through the prophets in order might never trip over Daniel at all. He is hiding in plain sight, one shelf over from where you would think to look. Add up all three factors, the unusual genre, the split personality of the language, and the odd filing decision, and you begin to understand how a book this important managed to become the quiet one in the corner that everybody underestimates. There is a reason this odd little book refuses to stay buried, though, and it has nothing to do with scholars. Every time a generation feels the ground shifting underneath it, every time the headlines turn ominous and the future starts to look uncertain, people reach for Daniel. When the world feels like it is tilting towards some kind of edge, this is the book they open, hunting for a map of whatever comes next. It has happened in age after age, in empire after empire, each one privately convinced it might be the last. And that instinct is not silly. Daniel is, after all, a book written by a man who watched his own world end and lived to describe what rose from the wreckage, which makes him uniquely qualified to speak to anyone who suspects their world might be ending too. He has been there. He knows what it is to see everything familiar collapse and to keep his footing anyway. That's a large part of why, strange genre and awkward filing and all, Daniel keeps getting pulled right back off the shelf. But here's where the story stops being about literary trivia and starts being about a person, because Daniel is not just a strange book. Daniel is a young man, and his personal story is where all of this comes to life. Picture him before any of the drama begins. He is a teenager, or close to it, born into the upper crust of Jerusalem society. Not a peasant scraping by in a mud brick house, but a young aristocrat, the kind of boy raised in comfort and expectation. The text goes out of its way to mention that he and his companions were handsome, physically fit, quick to learn, and thoroughly educated in every field worth knowing. In modern terms, he is the valedictorian who is also captain of the team and somehow still likable, the sort of young person whose future practically arranges itself. Doors open before he even reaches them. Everyone assumes he is going places, and he is in fact going places, just not the places anyone had in mind for him. Here is the bitter irony sitting right at the center of his life, and it is worth pausing on because it flips a lot of our assumptions upside down. We tend to think of talent, good looks, brains, and privilege as a kind of shield, the collection of advantages that keeps a person safe and comfortable. For Daniel, those very advantages became the exact thing that painted a target on his back. When a conquering empire rolls into a defeated city hunting for the cream of the crop to haul away, it does not want the weak, the sick, or the forgettable. It wants precisely the young man who is healthy, brilliant, well-bred, and bursting with potential. His gifts did not protect him. His gifts made him valuable, and being valuable to an empire is an extremely dangerous thing to be. The straight-A student with the wide-open future became, overnight, premium imperial merchandise. Not exactly the reward the guidance counselor had promised. There is one more thing that makes Daniel unusual among the prophets, and it is easy to miss. Most of the great prophetic voices operated from the outside. They stood in the streets or the temple courts and shouted in from the margins, unwelcome critics of the people in power. Daniel did the opposite. Daniel spent his entire adult life on the inside, working within the machinery of the very empires he warned about, climbing their bureaucracies, advising their kings, sitting in on the councils that ran the known world. He is that rare figure, a man of deep faith planted at the highest levels of a thoroughly godless government, expected to be brilliant, loyal, and useful, while somehow never surrendering the core of who he was. It is a genuinely brutal tightrope, the sort most people tumble off within a week, and the fact that he walked it for decades without either compromising his convictions or getting himself quietly executed is a large part of what makes his story so remarkable. He proves over and over again that a person can serve inside a system without ever truly belonging to it. So hold this picture in your mind because it is the hinge the whole book turns on. A young man who had everything is about to lose the one thing that money and status could not buy him, which is his freedom. And in exchange for that freedom, he is going to be handed something no one else in his generation would receive, something worth more than the comfortable life that was stolen from him. He is going to be given a window, a clear, unobstructed view straight into the future of the entire human race. It is a spectacularly lopsided trade in the short term, and an almost unimaginable one in the long term, and it all begins with a catastrophe. Before we walk into that catastrophe, one last note on how to actually read what follows, because it will make everything land harder. Every single episode in this book operates on 2 levels at once, and if you only watch one, you miss half the picture. On the first level, these are real events, anchored to real dirt and real dates in the 6th century before Christ. Actual armies marched, an actual city fell, actual young men were dragged hundreds of miles from home. This is history, not fable. But on the second level, every one of those events casts a long shadow forward, working as a preview, a rough sketch, a scale model of the final days of human history. The technical word people use is a type, a pattern that happens once in miniature and is destined to play out again on a far larger stage. So as we go, keep both eyes open. One eye on the ancient world, watching it unfold exactly as it happened, and one eye on the horizon, watching the same shape appear again in the distance. Hold that dual focus, and the Book of Daniel stops being a dusty relic and turns into something closer to a map. Now let us go to the moment the ground gives way. To understand why any of this happened at all, it helps to zoom out from one city to the whole neighborhood, because Jerusalem did not fall in a vacuum. For generations, the small kingdom of Judah had lived the precarious life of a minnow swimming between sharks. To the north and east, one superpower after another rose, swallowed its rivals, and went hunting for more. The mighty Assyrian Empire had dominated the region for ages until it finally cracked under its own weight, and the instant it collapsed, Babylon surged up to claim the vacancy. Judah, perched on a strategically valuable strip of land, had the misfortune of lying directly along the road these giants used to reach one another. Small kingdoms in that position had essentially two options: pay tribute and survive as a vassal, or gamble on rebellion and pray a bigger patron would ride to the rescue. Judah, unfortunately, kept choosing the gamble, switching loyalties and betting on alliances that never quite paid off. Nebuchadnezzar had already made his irritation clear more than once, carting off earlier waves of captives and propping up puppet rulers to keep the little kingdom in line. So when the final assault came, it was less a bolt from a clear sky than the last, heaviest blow in a long bout Judah had been slowly losing for years. And that assault was not a gentle affair. The king behind it, Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of the rising Babylonian Empire and quite possibly the most powerful human being alive at the time, brought his army to the walls of Jerusalem and settled in for the kill. Jerusalem was not some minor village. It was the beating heart of an entire people, the city that held their temple, their history, and their whole sense of who they were. And it fell. The walls that were supposed to keep the world out failed to do so, and the most powerful army of the age poured through the breach. What came next was thorough and deliberate, the kind of conquest engineered not merely to win but to humiliate. And the man behind that army was no ordinary warlord. Nebuchadnezzar was, by almost any measure, the outstanding ruler of his era, a commander of real military genius married to the vision of a great builder. He did not simply conquer, he constructed, pouring the plunder of the nations into turning his capital into a wonder. He was brilliant, tireless, and utterly convinced of his own greatness, which is a combustible mix in a man with limitless power and no one able to tell him no. To fall into the hands of a king like that was to fall under the shadow of someone who genuinely believed the world existed to serve his ambitions. He is going to loom over much of this book, and he is going to be humbled in ways he could never have pictured. But at this opening moment, he stands at the absolute peak of his powers, the most formidable human being on the planet, and Daniel is about to become his property. The first target, predictably, was the temple, because in the ancient world, the fastest way to break a nation's spirit was to break its gods. Nebuchadnezzar's men stripped the sacred house of its treasures and carried off the holy vessels, the gold and silver objects that had been set apart for worship, the equipment used in the most sacred rituals of the nation. These were not looted for their scrap value alone, though the metal certainly did not hurt. They were carried back to Babylon as trophies, hauled into the treasure house of a foreign god, as proof that Babylon's deity had apparently beaten Jerusalem's god in single combat. It was, in the logic of the day, a scoreboard. And by that scoreboard, Jerusalem had just been shut out. Those vessels are going to matter enormously later, so tuck them into the back of your mind now. They have not seen the last of the spotlight. It is worth pausing to ask why any of this was permitted at all, because the answer reframes the whole disaster. For generations, the prophets had been delivering the same unwelcome message to Judah, warning that a nation which abandoned its God and drifted into injustice and idolatry could not expect to be shielded forever. The warnings were ignored, as warnings usually are, right up until the day they came true. So the fall of Jerusalem was not the random cruelty of an indifferent universe, and it was certainly not proof that Babylon's gods had won. It was, in the grim logic of the story, the long-promised consequence finally arriving on schedule. And that matters enormously for how we read everything that follows, because it means even this catastrophe was never outside of God's reach. The empire thought it was writing the story. In truth, it was being used to turn a page. The same God who let the city fall was already positioning a handful of faithful young men in the enemy's own capital, exactly where they would need to be for the next few thousand years of prophecy to unfold. Nobody in Babylon suspected that for a second. They thought they were collecting slaves. They were, without the faintest idea, delivering a prophet to his post. But the empire did not stop at gold. Metal, after all, only takes you so far. The truly valuable spoil of any conquest was people, and this is where our young aristocrat enters the machine. Nebuchadnezzar gave specific orders about exactly which kind of captives he wanted, and the specifications read almost like a job listing. He wanted young men from the royal family and the nobility without physical defect, good-looking, gifted in wisdom, quick to understand, and fit to serve in the palace. In other words, he skimmed the very top off the top. The best educated, best connected, most promising youth of an entire nation were rounded up and marched off toward Babylon, a journey of many hundreds of miles across some genuinely inhospitable terrain. And Daniel, along with 3 of his companions, was right there in the selection. His talents had once again gotten him noticed, unfortunately. Now it is tempting to soften what this was. It is tempting to imagine it as some kind of prestigious scholarship program, a fast track to the big city, an ancient version of getting recruited by the most impressive firm in the empire. But that is a comfortable modern fiction, and it does not survive contact with reality. This was not a career opportunity. This was a forced deportation. These young men did not apply, did not interview, and were not asked for their opinion at any point in the process. They were captives extracted from a defeated city against their will, torn away from their families, and reprogrammed to serve a system that had just crushed everything they loved. The empire was not offering them a future, it was confiscating the future they already had and installing a new one, custom-built to serve Babylon's needs. The comfortable scholarship narrative, in short, is not quite the story the movies would sell you. And the getting there was its own ordeal. Babylon lay hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, and there was no straight road across the desert that lay between them. Instead, the captives were marched the long way around, following the curve of the great rivers through the arc of fertile land the ancient world depended on, a route that stretched the trip into weeks of walking. These were pampered young nobles, remember? Boys raised with servants and soft beds, now trudging in a column of prisoners under the eyes of imperial guards, watching their homeland shrink and disappear behind them with every step. Somewhere along that road, each of them had to come to terms with the fact that they were never going home, at least not as the people they had been. By the time their destination rose on the horizon, the boys who arrived were already very different from the boys who had set out. And what a destination it was! If the intent was to make a captive feel small, Babylon accomplished the job before anyone said a single word. This was arguably the greatest city the world had yet produced, a sprawling showcase of imperial power wrapped in walls so massive that ancient writers swore chariots could race along the top of them. Inside stood a towering step temple that clawed toward the sky, grand processional avenues lined with glazed brick and prowling stone lions, and gardens so lush and improbable that later generations would list them among the wonders of the world. Everything about the place was engineered to broadcast one message to anyone who entered, which was that Babylon was eternal, Babylon was supreme, and resistance was not merely dangerous but faintly ridiculous. For a handful of teenage exiles from a conquered hill town, walking through those gates must have felt like being swallowed whole. The empire wanted them awed. Awe, after all, is the first cousin of surrender. It would be a mistake to move past the exile too quickly, as though it were merely an unpleasant change of address. For the people of Judah, this was a wound that cut clean to the bone. An entire nation was ripped from the land it believed had been given to it, separated from the temple that sat at the very center of its worship, and dropped into a foreign country to live among the monuments of the gods who had supposedly defeated them. There is a haunting picture of exiles sitting down beside the rivers of that strange land, and weeping when they remembered home, unable to bring themselves to sing the old songs on foreign soil. That is the emotional weather Daniel and his friends were living in, a grief that soaked into everything. They were not simply relocated professionals adjusting to a new office. They were survivors of a national catastrophe, carrying the memory of a burning city and a plundered temple, trying to figure out how to keep faith in a God who, from the outside, appeared to have lost. Everything Daniel does from here forward, he does under that cloud, which makes his steadiness all the more astonishing. And then came the part that reveals what Babylon was truly after, the part that is genuinely chilling once you see the logic behind it. The empire launched a deliberate program of re-education, and it went far beyond teaching these young men a few new administrative skills. The goal was to reach inside their heads and quietly overwrite who they were. The method worked on 4 fronts, and each one was aimed with precision at a different pillar of their identity. First, they came for the names. In the ancient world, a name was not a fashion accessory, it was a declaration. Daniel's Hebrew name carried the meaning that God is his judge, a small sentence about his God stitched right into his identity, spoken aloud every time anyone called for him. His three friends carried names woven from the same divine thread, each one a quiet reminder of the God of their homeland. So Babylon replaced them. Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar, a name that instead honored a Babylonian deity, and his three companions were rebranded in exactly the same fashion, their God-bearing Hebrew names swapped out for names that saluted the gods of their captors. This was not bureaucratic convenience, it was a surgical strike. Change a person's name, and you change the sentence they hear about themselves 100 times a day. You slowly retrain their ears to forget the God they came from and salute the gods they now serve. It was identity theft in the most literal sense, several thousand years before anyone thought to sell insurance against it. It is worth lingering on those three friends for a moment because their story is stitched into the same theft. Back home, they were known by names that each carried a fragment of their faith, one meaning that the Lord shows grace, one asking who is like God, one declaring the Lord to be a helper. Every time someone called out to them, a quiet confession of their God went along with it. Babylon scrubbed all three clean and issued replacements built from the names of its own gods, so that the boys would now spend their days answering to titles that honored the very deities their people had refused to worship. It was a small daily humiliation, repeated so constantly that it was designed to stop feeling like humiliation at all and simply become their new normal. That is how the erasure was meant to work. Not one dramatic blow, but 1,000 ordinary repetitions until the old self quietly faded from memory. Second, they came for the language. The captives were enrolled in an intensive course in the tongue and literature of the Babylonians, immersed in the sacred stories, the wisdom traditions, and the entire worldview of the empire. This was not merely a matter of learning to order dinner in a new city. To absorb a civilization's literature is to slowly absorb its assumptions about reality, its picture of the gods, its sense of what is true and what actually matters. The empire understood that if you fill a young mind with your stories for long enough, your stories become the water it swims in, and eventually it forgets there was ever any other ocean. It was, in effect, a total cultural download, running quietly in the background whether the captives consented to it or not. Third, they came for the clothing and the customs, the outward markers of belonging. Strip away the familiar garments of home and dress a person in the uniform of the empire, and something subtle shifts. He begins to look like everyone around him, and looking the part is very often the first step toward becoming the part. Every visible trace that these young men came from somewhere else, that they belonged to another people with another story, was steadily sanded down until they blended seamlessly into the Babylonian court. On the outside, at least, the transformation was meant to be complete. And fourth, in a move that will echo loudly through the chapters ahead, they came for the food. The captives were assigned a daily ration from the king's own table, the finest cuisine the empire had to offer, rich meat and choice wine straight from the royal kitchens. On the surface, this looks like pure generosity, even luxury. Who complains about being fed from the king's table? But that royal menu carried hidden strings, and Daniel saw them clearly, which is exactly where our next chapter is headed. For now, it is enough to notice the pattern: names, language, clothing, food. 4 coordinated blows aimed at 4 pillars of a person, all serving one unified purpose. The empire did not merely want these young men to obey, it wanted them to forget, to wake up one morning and no longer remember that they had ever belonged to anyone but Babylon. There is a grim intelligence to this whole approach that is almost worth admiring in the way you might admire a beautifully built trap. A lesser empire simply kills its enemies, but the dead are useless, and their children grow up remembering exactly who did the killing. A cleverer empire does something far more permanent. It does not destroy the people, it absorbs them. It takes the brightest of the defeated, treats them well, feeds them from the royal kitchen, teaches them the language, hands them positions of comfort, and then lets a single generation quietly do the rest. Give it enough time, and the grandchildren of the conquered will defend the empire as their own, having forgotten there was ever anything else to be. Chains rust and armies eventually go home, but a rewritten identity tends to stay rewritten. Babylon grasps that the surest conquest is the one the conquered stop noticing, and that is a strategy which has never really gone out of style, And this is the exact point where our two levels snap into alignment for the very first time, where the ancient event lifts off the page and becomes a preview of something still ahead of us. Here is the first great connection of this book, and it sets the pattern for everything to come. Look closely at what actually happened. An entire world, or at least an entire world that mattered to these people, was brought under the heel of a single ruler. One man, Nebuchadnezzar, held the fate of nations in his hand, and everyone within reach of his empire was expected to bow, blend, and conform to one dominant culture. One king, one system, one way of life, pressed down from the top onto everyone underneath. Now shift your gaze to the far horizon, to the last days Daniel keeps pointing toward. And the same shape rises up again, only bigger. The scriptures describe a coming figure, a final world ruler often called the Antichrist, who will do on a global scale exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did on a regional one. He will pull the nations under a single authority, build one sprawling empire that stretches across the whole earth, and press humanity to conform to one unified system, one culture, one allegiance. Ancient Babylon, seen in this light, is not merely a historical setting. It is a stage set, a scale model, a dress rehearsal for the world empire still to come. Everything Nebuchadnezzar did to a handful of captives in one city is a rough draft of what that final ruler will attempt with the entire human race. Babylon is the preview, the main feature is still loading. And notice the particular flavor of what makes this kind of empire so effective, because it is not only force. Raw conquest can take a city, but it cannot hold a heart. What the truly ambitious empire offers alongside the sword is a story about unity, the seductive promise that if everyone would simply speak the same language, honor the same authority, and bow toward the same center, then the chaos of a divided world could finally give way to peace and order. It is a genuinely attractive pitch, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. The final world ruler Daniel keeps gesturing toward will not come knocking door to door demanding surrender at knife point, or at least not at first. He will come selling harmony, offering a tired and fractured planet the comfort of one system that ties everything neatly together. The catch, the very same catch buried in Babylon's generous plate of royal food, is that the price of belonging to that single system is the quiet surrender of everything that once made you distinct. Above all, your loyalty to a God who refuses to share a throne with anyone. Unity sounds wonderful right up until you read the fine print about who exactly you have to stop being in order to get it. And once you see that, the personal stakes of the story become impossible to ignore, because they stop being ancient and start feeling uncomfortably close to home. Think for a moment about the specific freedoms that were quietly stripped from Daniel and his friends the day they walked through Babylon's gates. The freedom to be called by their true names, the names that pointed to their God. The freedom to learn their own stories instead of someone else's. The freedom to worship openly, to speak the name of the one they trusted without a court full of imperial officials watching for any flicker of disloyalty. These are the kinds of freedoms most of us treat as background furniture, so ordinary we forget they are even there. The freedom to gather and worship without asking permission. The freedom to say out loud what you believe about God. The freedom to open the scriptures and read them without fear. We assume these things the way we assume gravity, and we rarely notice them at all until the day they are suddenly gone. Daniel's story is a warning shot fired across the centuries, a reminder that a system determined to reshape people has always started in exactly the same place, by going after identity, language, worship, and daily practice, and that the pressure to conform can be dressed up as generosity. The king's table, after all, looked like a gift. The re-education looked like an education. The new names looked almost like a promotion. The machine rarely announces itself as a machine. It usually shows up smiling, holding a plate of very good food, asking only that you quietly become someone else in exchange. Now here is the quiet drama running underneath all of this. The thing that Forefront program was really testing. Not every captive resisted. History does not record most of their names, and that silence is itself the point. The overwhelming pressure to blend in worked on the majority exactly as intended. Plenty of those bright young men presumably took the new name, ate the new food, absorbed the new stories, and slowly dissolved into the empire until nothing of their origin remained. It is the path of least resistance, and in fairness, it is genuinely the reasonable choice. Fighting a superpower over your dinner menu sounds, on paper, like an excellent way to get yourself killed for absolutely nothing. What set Daniel apart was not that he was braver by temperament or louder by nature. It was that somewhere along that long road into exile, he had already decided what kind of person he intended to remain, and he decided it before the pressure ever arrived. He drew his lines in advance, in the calm, so that when the test finally came in the storm, there was nothing left to negotiate. That is a lesson which reaches straight across the centuries, because the people who hold firm under pressure are almost never the ones deciding what they believe in the heat of the moment. They are the ones who quietly settled it long before anyone was watching. Which brings us to the question this whole opening act is built to ask, the one Daniel is about to answer with his fork, of all things. What does a person of faith actually do when the entire system, with all its power and all its charm, sets out to rewrite who they are? When your name is changed, your language replaced, your clothing swapped, and even your meals engineered to reshape you, where exactly do you draw the line? Do you swallow it all and vanish into the crowd? Or do you find one small, unglamorous place to stand and simply refuse to move? Daniel, this brilliant young captive stripped of nearly everything he owned, is about to make a decision that looks almost laughably minor on the surface. He is going to make a choice about dinner. And that quiet, stubborn, deeply unimpressive sounding choice is going to set the tone for one of the boldest lives in the entire Bible, and pry open the first door to everything the future still holds. So let us finally sit down at that famous table, because the whole thing was a trap, and Daniel spotted it before he had swallowed a single bite. On the surface, being fed from the king's own kitchen was the sweetest deal in the entire re-education program. Everyone else was getting their identity quietly filed down, and here came dinner, glistening and expensive, the one part of the arrangement that looked like a straightforward gift. Rich meat, fine wine, the best the empire could plate up, delivered daily to a handful of foreign teenagers who, a few weeks earlier, had been marched across a desert in chains. On paper, it reads like an upgrade. In reality, it was the most dangerous item on the entire menu. Here is what made it a trap. And it worked on two separate levels at once, which is a fitting way for a book this layered to start. On the first level, the food was simply unclean by the standards of Daniel's faith. His people lived under a detailed set of dietary laws, an ancient code spelling out which animals were permitted and which were off limits, how meat was to be handled, and how blood was to be drained. To an outsider, these rules can look like fussy kitchen bookkeeping, but for Daniel, they were nothing of the sort. Every meal was a small daily act of belonging, a quiet way of remembering which God he answered to. Eating was worship in miniature 3 times a day. The Babylonian table, stacked high with whatever the royal cooks felt like serving, ignored every one of those boundaries. It was, in effect, an all-you-can-eat buffet of everything he had been raised never to touch. But the second level was the one that truly mattered, and it turned a dietary problem into a spiritual one. In the ancient world, the finest food and wine did not go straight from the kitchen to the table. It went first to the temple. Portions of the king's provisions were routinely offered to the Babylonian gods as an act of devotion before the leftovers made their way to the dining hall. So every plate that arrived in front of Daniel had, in a very real sense, already been to church, just not his church. To eat it was to quietly participate in the worship of gods he did not serve, to nod along, one bite at a time, to the idea that Babylon's deities deserved the credit for the meal. The food was not merely against the rules, it was consecrated to the competition. Accepting it was a small, delicious act of surrender dressed up as fine dining. And this is exactly why the food front of the program was so clever and why it had been saved for last. Names, language, and clothing hit a person on the outside. Food reached all the way in. You can wear a foreign uniform and answer to a foreign name while still, somewhere deep down, holding on to who you are. But sit down every night and eat what has been offered to another god, and slowly, invisibly, the last wall comes down. The empire understood that the stomach is a surprisingly effective road to the soul, which is a lesson every grandmother has also independently discovered. Feed a person long enough and warmly enough, and they tend to stop asking difficult questions about where the food came from. There was a social dimension to all this too, one that made the plate even more loaded than it first appears. In the ancient world, sharing a table was never merely about nutrition. To eat with someone was to bind yourself to them, to declare that you belonged in their circle and stood under their protection and their obligations. A shared meal was a kind of contract you signed with your mouth. So to sit down every evening and eat the king's food alongside the king's men was to quietly announce, night after night, that you had become one of them, a full member of the household of Babylon. Refusing the food, then, was not a private dietary quirk. It was a polite but unmistakable declaration that Daniel had not, in the deepest sense, joined. He would serve the empire, work for it, even rise within it, but he would not become it. And he drew that boundary at the dinner table, which, when you think about it, is exactly where such boundaries have always been drawn and defended. In every family and every culture, right down to the present. Daniel, unfortunately for the empire, kept asking those difficult questions. And here is the part that reveals what kind of young man we are dealing with, because his response was not what you would expect from a teenager in his position. He did not stage a dramatic protest. He did not flip the table, refuse to eat, or deliver a fiery speech about idols to a room full of imperial officials, which, given the circumstances, would have been a very short-lived career move. Loud defiance in the heart of an empire that had just leveled your hometown is not courage. It is a fast track to becoming a cautionary tale. Daniel understood the difference between a conviction and a tantrum, so he did something far smarter and, in its own quiet way, far braver. He went to the official in charge of the captives and made a respectful request. He resolved in his heart not to defile himself with the royal food, and then he politely asked to be excused from it. No threats, no theatrics, just a calm, firm line drawn in the sand, and a courteous request for the man in charge to honor it. This is the diplomacy of the deeply convinced, someone who knows exactly where he stands, but has no interest in making a spectacle of it. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was simply not going to bend on the one thing he had already decided he would never bend on. The official, to his credit, was sympathetic. He had apparently grown fond of Daniel, which tends to happen with the ones who are both principled and pleasant, a rare combination in any century. But sympathy did not make his situation any easier because the man was caught in a real bind, and his concern was refreshingly specific. If Daniel and his friends showed up to their evaluation looking pale, thin, and undernourished compared to the other captives stuffing themselves at the royal table, the king would want to know why. And in an empire where displeasing the king could be a permanently health-altering experience, the official's own neck was quite literally on the line. His idea of a performance review had unusually high stakes. Fail to keep the merchandise plump and glowing, and you might not be around for the next quarter. So Daniel, ever the negotiator, offered a solution that took all the risk off the official's shoulders and put it squarely on his own. He proposed a trial. Give us 10 days, he suggested, and during that stretch, feed the four of us nothing but vegetables and water. At the end of the 10 days, compare us to the young men eating from the king's table, and then decide based on what you see with your own eyes. It was, when you think about it, a masterful move. It was low commitment, easy to reverse, and it handed the official a graceful way out. If the experiment failed, no harm done. Back to the meat, no one the wiser. And crucially, it turned an abstract argument about religious law into a simple, measurable test that anyone could judge. Daniel was not asking to be trusted. He was asking to be checked. That willingness to be checked is quietly remarkable, and it is a thread that runs far deeper into this book than a dinner menu. Daniel did not ask anyone to take his convictions on faith. He staked them on a visible, measurable result and invited the world to judge for itself. If God did not come through, the evidence would be sitting right there on his own gaunt face for everyone to see. That is not the nervous religion of someone hoping no one looks too closely. It is the confidence of someone so sure of the God he serves that he is happy to be put to the test in broad daylight. And it previews something important about the whole book because Daniel will go on to make astonishingly specific claims about the future, the kind of claims that either come true or embarrass you badly. This is not a faith that hides behind vagueness and hopes for the best. It is a faith that says, in effect, watch and see, then measure the outcome. The vegetables were only the first small experiment. The entire book, in its own way, is an invitation to check the results. Now, on paper, this was an absurd bet. A diet of plain vegetables and water going head-to-head against the finest cuisine an empire could produce. And Daniel was volunteering to prove that the salad would win. Every assumption of the day, and frankly most assumptions since, would say the well-fed group should come out ahead. Rich food was the food of the strong, the food of kings and warriors and people who mattered. Boiled vegetables and water were, at best, the food of the poor, and at worst, a slow decline. By every ordinary expectation, Daniel and his friends should have wilted like cut flowers. 10 days later, they had not wilted. They looked healthier, better nourished, and physically stronger than every single captive who had been feasting on the royal spread. The contrast was so plain that the official quietly stopped worrying, took away the rich food for good, and put the 4 of them on their vegetable regimen from then on. What began as a risky 10-day experiment became, without any fanfare, the standard diet at court, at least for these 4. The buffet lost, the garden won. Now, it would be easy to walk away from this thinking. The point is that vegetables are good for you, which is true but also spectacularly beside the point. Yes, one can gently observe that a nightly diet of heavy meat and free-flowing wine has never been the secret to peak human condition, a fact anyone who has survived a week of business dinners can confirm. But the text is not running an ancient nutrition study, and reducing it to 1 misses everything. The book is clear that this outcome was not the salad's doing. It was God's. The health and strength that showed up on those 4 young men were a blessing, a quiet sign that when a person honors God in a decision that costs them something, God is fully capable of handling the rest. The vegetables were just the vehicle. The result was the message. And here, right on schedule, is where our 2 levels lock together again, because this small standoff over dinner is a preview of one of the most famous confrontations in all of prophecy. Cast your mind forward to the final days that Daniel keeps aiming at, and you find another test routed straight through a person's need to eat. The book of Revelation describes a coming system in which a mark, a badge of allegiance to the final world ruler, becomes mandatory for ordinary economic life. Without it, no one will be able to buy or sell. Read that slowly because it is easy to skate past the weight of it. No buying and no selling does not mean you miss out on a few luxuries. It means you cannot purchase food. It means the entire marketplace, the whole machinery of getting a meal onto your table, is switched off for anyone who refuses to pledge loyalty to the system. Do you see the shape repeating? Daniel's crisis and the final crisis are the exact same crisis, separated by a few thousand years and scaled up enormously. In both cases, the pressure to conform is aimed straight at the stomach. In both cases, the price of staying faithful is going hungry, and the reward for compromise is a full plate. The empire always seems to figure out sooner or later that the surest way to bend a person is to stand between them and their next meal. Then it was a tempting dish laid out to buy a young man's loyalty. In the end, it will be an entire economy locked shut to starve out anyone who will not bow. The plate has grown into a planet, but the choice on offer is identical. You can be fed and owned, or free and hungry. Daniel, at the ripe age of not quite grown, picked free and hungry, and by doing so, he sketched, in miniature, the exact stand that faithful people will one day be asked to make on the largest possible stage. His refusal of a plate is a rough draft of their refusal of a mark. And notice the disguise, because it is the same disguise both times, which is the truly unsettling part. The king's food did not arrive labeled as a spiritual trap. It arrived labeled as generosity, a perk, a kindness. The loyalty test was hidden inside a gift. The coming mark works exactly the same way. It will not be presented as a demand to worship a tyrant because almost no one would knowingly sign up for that. It will be presented as a convenience, a sensible upgrade, the key that unlocks the marketplace and keeps daily life running smoothly. The worship question will be buried underneath a practical benefit, dressed in the friendly language of ease and access, so that taking it feels less like bowing to a ruler and more like simply getting on with your life. That is the genius of the trap in both eras. The empire almost never asks for your soul directly. It asks for something small and useful and collects your soul as the shipping fee, which is why the ability to recognize the loyalty test hidden inside the harmless offer is one of the most valuable skills a person of faith can ever develop, and why Daniel, who saw straight through a dinner plate, makes such a fitting guide to the days ahead. There is a deeply encouraging twist buried in all this, though, and it is worth pulling out into the light, because Daniel's story does not end with him nobly starving in a corner for his principles. Quite the opposite. His refusal, the very act that should by all rights have derailed his future, is what launched it. Saying no to the king's food did not close the door on his career, it swung it wide open. The text goes on to note that God gave these 4 young men exceptional knowledge and skill, and that Daniel in particular was granted insight into visions and dreams, the gift that would define the rest of his extraordinary life. The stand at the table was not a detour away from his calling, it was the on-ramp to it. This is the principle worth carrying with you long after the details of ancient dietary law have faded, and it runs against nearly everything our instincts tell us. We tend to assume that faithfulness in the small stuff is a luxury we can afford only once the big stuff is settled. That integrity is something to be spent carefully and never wasted on minor matters. Surely we think God does not sweat the dinner menu, but Daniel got the order backward from how the world runs it, and it made all the difference. He was faithful in the small, unglamorous, almost invisible test first, the kind of test no one would have blamed him for quietly failing, and that faithfulness is exactly what qualified him for everything larger that came after. The small door, it turns out, is how you reach the big room. Faithfulness in the little things does not shrink your future, it builds it. There is a shadow side to this same principle, and Daniel understood it instinctively, which is why he refused to take even the first bite. Identity is very rarely surrendered in one dramatic act of betrayal. Almost nobody wakes up one morning and decides, "Today I will abandon everything I believe." It goes instead by erosion, one small and reasonable-sounding concession at a time, each one so minor on its own that resisting it feels almost silly. Just this once. It is only food. Everyone else is doing it. What could a single compromise possibly cost? The trouble is that the first small yes makes the second one easier, and the second makes the third nearly automatic, until one day the person looks up and cannot remember when exactly they stopped being who they were. Daniel refused the very first domino precisely because he understood how dominoes work. He was not being rigid over a triviality. He was guarding the top of a slope because he knew that the easiest place to stop a slide is at the very beginning, before any momentum has a chance to build. Hold the first line, and the rest tend to hold with it. Give it away, and you may never find solid ground again. There is an old principle behind all of this, one that would later be put into a single memorable line, that if you seek first the kingdom of God and place that loyalty ahead of everything else, then all the other things you were anxiously chasing get added in as well. Daniel is that principle wearing sandals. He put his allegiance to God ahead of his comfort, his safety, and his standing, fully prepared to lose all three, and instead of losing them, he ended up keeping his integrity and his health and his position, with a promotion thrown in for good measure. Now, this is not some tidy vending machine where obedience mechanically dispenses rewards, and it would be dishonest to pretend faithfulness never costs anything, because later chapters will make painfully clear that sometimes it costs a great deal. But the deeper pattern holds when you get the priorities in the right order. When the kingdom goes first and the plate goes second, provision has a way of following that no amount of anxious grasping ever manages to produce. And there is one more quiet observation tucked into this scene, easy to overlook but worth naming, because it reframes what a single stubborn choice can do. Daniel did not make his stand alone. 3 friends stood right there beside him, refusing the same food, taking the same risk, drawing the same line. Whether Daniel talked them into it or they arrived at it together, the effect is the same. Conviction, it turns out, is contagious. One person quietly drawing a line makes it dramatically easier for the next person to draw theirs, and courage has a way of spreading through a room like warmth. Even the nervous official caught it, taking a real risk on behalf of 4 captives simply because the fruit of their obedience was so plainly visible that ignoring it felt wrong. That is how it tends to work. When you truly stand for something and stand well, people around you notice, and a surprising number of them find the nerve to stand too. Integrity is not a solo performance. It is closer to a spark, and sparks rarely stay put. Step back for a moment and take in how absurdly small this whole confrontation must have looked from Babylon's side, because that is part of the lesson too. To the vast machinery of the empire, 4 foreign teenagers requesting a special menu was, at most, a mildly amusing administrative footnote, the sort of thing a mid-level official handled between more important matters and forgot by lunch. Nobody in the palace sensed that anything significant was happening. There were no armies involved, no thrones at stake, No dramatic showdown, just a quiet request about produce. And yet, in hindsight, this forgettable little episode was one of the most consequential moments of the young man's entire life, the hinge on which everything else would turn. That is worth sitting with because the most important battles a person ever fights almost never look important from the outside. They look like small, private, unglamorous choices that the world walks right past without a second glance. The moment a soul quietly decides who it will and will not belong to rarely makes the news. It usually happens over something as ordinary as dinner, so the four of them pass their first great test, not with a sword or a speech, but with a plate of vegetables and a spine that would not bend. They are now positioned inside the court, trusted, healthy, and quietly marked out for something bigger. And this is the moment to pause because the book is about to change gears entirely. Everything up to this point has been recognizable human drama, captives and kings, and clever negotiations over dinner. What comes next gets stranger, wilder, and far more cosmic, full of dreams and beasts and thrones and futures unrolling across centuries. Before we plunge into all of that, you deserve a map. And it happens that the book comes with one built in if you know where to look. Here is a detail most casual readers never catch, and once you see it, the whole book snaps into a new shape. The central section of Daniel, the 6 chapters running from the 2nd through the 7th, is not just a loose pile of stories arranged in whatever order they happened. It is built. Deliberately, artfully built, according to a design that ancient writers adored and modern readers mostly stroll right past. The technical name for it is a chiasm, but you can forget the jargon and simply picture a mirror. The book folds in half, and the two halves reflect each other, matched pair for matched pair until they meet in the middle. The first thing rhymes with the last thing, the second thing rhymes with the second to last, and so on inward like ripples running toward a center point. It is the literary equivalent of a perfectly symmetrical building, and it is no accident. You might reasonably wonder why an ancient author would go to all that trouble, folding a book into a mirror instead of just telling the stories in a straight line like a sensible person. The answer says a great deal about the world he was writing for. This was a culture that lived by the ear far more than the eye, where texts were meant to be read aloud and heard, held in memory rather than flipped through on a shelf. In a world like that, structure was not decoration, it was engineering. A symmetrical shape helped a listener hold an enormous amount of material in their head, gave them landmarks to navigate by, and most importantly, told them where to pay attention. When the two halves of a story rhyme and everything folds toward a center, that center lights up automatically. The shape itself becomes a giant arrow pointing at the main idea, no highlighter required. Ancient writers built meaning into architecture because they trusted their audience to feel the symmetry even when they could not have named it. It is a craftsmanship we have largely lost, which is exactly why most modern readers walk straight past one of the most carefully constructed books in the whole library. And here is a small bonus that ties back to something we noticed earlier about the two languages. That mirrored central block, the 6 chapters folded so neatly into one another, lines up almost perfectly with the section written in the shared imperial tongue rather than in Hebrew. The part addressed to the whole world is also the part built with the most deliberate artistry, as though the author reserved his finest architecture for the message meant to travel furthest. The languages and the structure are not two separate curiosities. They are pointing in the same direction, both quietly flagging the middle of the book as the place where the biggest, most universal claims are being made. When a text goes to that much trouble to say, "Look here," it is usually worth looking. Let me walk you through the reflection because it is elegant once it comes into focus. The outermost pair, the 2nd and 7th chapters, both deliver a sweeping panorama of world history, a vision of 4 great kingdoms rising and falling in sequence, the whole future march of empires captured in a single image. One version arrives as a towering statue seen by a troubled king, the other as a parade of strange beasts seen by Daniel himself, but they are describing the very same procession from 2 different angles. They are the matched bookends of the whole structure, 2 windows looking out on the identical sweep of time. Step 1, ring inward, and you reach the 3rd and 6th chapters, and here the mirror gets even cleaner. Both are rescue stories, and both are the same rescue at heart, a faithful servant of God facing certain death and walking out alive. In one, it is a blazing furnace hot enough to kill the guards who stoke it. In the other, it is a den of hungry lions with a captive tossed in for the night. Different threat, different setting, identical miracle. God reaches into a death sentence and pulls his people out the far side, untouched. These two chapters are twins wearing different costumes, deliverance from fire on one side of the fold, deliverance from Fang on the other. And step one more ring inward, to the very heart of the structure, the fourth and fifth chapters. And you find the theme the whole mirror has been steering you toward all along. Because in a design like this, the center is not an afterthought. The center is the entire point. Everything folds inward toward it precisely to draw your eye there, the way the middle of a target is the part you are meant to hit. And what sits at the dead center of Daniel? Two proud kings, two rulers convinced of their own greatness, each one riding high on his own power, and each one brought crashing down by the God he refused to acknowledge. One is humbled and in mercy eventually restored. The other is weighed, found wanting, and finished off in a single night. Two portraits of arrogance meeting its limit, placed side by side at the exact spot the whole book has been quietly aiming your attention. And place that center in the frame of the larger series and it grows even bigger than two ancient kings. If the heart of the book is a portrait of proud rulers colliding with the God they would not acknowledge, then it is also, on the second level we keep returning to, a preview of the ultimate proud ruler and his ultimate reckoning. The final world figure Daniel keeps circling toward will be arrogance perfected, a man who exalts himself above every god and every authority, convinced beyond all reason of his own supremacy. And the center of this mirror quietly gives away how that story ends before it has even begun. Proud kings do not get the last word here. They never do. Every arrogant ruler in this book is a small rehearsal for the fall of the greatest one, and every humbling is a down payment on the final humbling still to come. The center of the book is, in a sense, the whole message in miniature, the outcome of history spoiled in advance for anyone paying attention. And that is the doorway into the single most important thread in the entire book, the one I want you to start watching for right now because it is going to run silently underneath every story from here to the final page. It is a law as old as the story of the world, and Daniel puts it on repeat. God humbles the proud and God lifts up the humble. That is it. That is the current running through all of it. Watch how it plays out in the fates of the characters, and it stops looking like a collection of unrelated adventures and starts looking like a single argument told 6 different ways. Notice who goes up and who comes down, and above all, notice why. Keep one eye from this point forward on the humble ones. Daniel and his 3 friends, captives with nothing, no army, no title, no leverage, who keep refusing to grasp for power and keep mysteriously being handed it anyway. Every time an empire changes hands or a king falls, these 4 somehow rise a little higher, not because they schemed their way up, but because they stayed low and stayed faithful. And keep the other eye on the proud ones, the kings and officials and schemers who are certain they hold all the cards, who trust in their own greatness and their own cleverness, and who, one after another, are dismantled by it. The pattern is so consistent it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a rule of the universe, because that is exactly what the book claims it is. And once you have the thread in hand, you begin to notice it operating on 2 scales at the same time, which is the mark of how deeply it is woven in. On the small scale, it plays out in people, individual men rising and falling according to whether they grasp for greatness or surrender it. But zoom out, and the very same law governs the empires themselves. Watch the great kingdoms parade through these visions, each one swaggering onto the stage, certain it will last forever, each one convinced it is the final word in human power, and each one, without exception, toppling to make room for the next. The kingdoms are simply the proud kings written large, whole civilizations puffed up with their own permanence and then quietly swept aside on schedule. The same rule that lifts a humble captive over an arrogant king lifts one empire over another and, in the end, lifts an everlasting kingdom over all of them. Pride comes down, it always comes down. Whether it wears a crown or commands an army or spans a continent makes no difference at all. The thread runs through the individual and the international alike, and it never once breaks. Now, a deliberate choice about how we are going to handle this thread, and it is worth stating plainly so you know the plan. I am not going to stop at every single chapter to point at the pattern and announce, there it is again. That would get tiresome fast, and worse, it would blunt the effect. Instead, I'm going to let it accumulate quietly, story by story, rise after rise and fall after fall, and then gather the whole thing up at the very end, when the full weight of it can land in a single stroke. Think of it as loading a spring. Each story adds a little tension, and if I keep releasing it early, the finale has nothing left to deliver. So I will trust you to keep tracking it on your own. Every time someone climbs, mark it. Every time someone topples, mark that too. And when we reach the end, we will lay all the marks out together and see the shape they make, which is far more satisfying than being handed the answer in advance. This is what makes the fifth stop on our journey less a story in its own right and more a set of instructions for reading everything that follows. It is the map you unfold before stepping into unfamiliar country. Because the honest truth is that the book is about to get difficult. The clean human drama of captives and dinner tables is behind us, and ahead lie dreams that need decoding, beasts that stand for empires, numbers that hide dates, and angels who show up specifically to explain things Daniel himself could not understand. Without a map, it is easy to get lost in all that strangeness, to see only a swirl of horns and metals and fires and give up somewhere around the fourth beast. But with the map in hand, everything changes. You know the shape of the building you're walking through. You know the two halves mirror each other. You know the center is about pride and its reckoning. And above all, you know the one thread to follow through every twist, the quiet law that the proud come down and the humble go up. That single piece of knowledge transforms the whole experience of reading. It is the difference between wandering through a strange museum with no idea what you're looking at and walking through it beside a guide who has whispered in your ear, "Watch for this one thing and you will understand everything." Suddenly the visions are not random. The rescues are not just exciting escapes. The fallen kings are not merely colorful villains. They are all making the same point from different directions, all folding inward toward the same center, all illustrating the same unbreakable rule. The viewer who knows what to look for gets to read the book the way it was actually built to be read, as one deliberate, symmetrical, purposeful whole, rather than a scrapbook of famous scenes. There is one more reason to fix this thread in your mind before we move on, and it is a little more personal than literary. A pattern this relentless is not only describing kings and kingdoms from long ago, it is describing a fork in the road that every single person stands at, in ways large and small, all the time. There are really only two directions a human heart can travel in this book, upward into pride or downward into humility. And the whole point of laying the pattern out so plainly is so that by the end, you cannot help asking which direction you are quietly traveling in yourself. We will save the full force of that question for later, where it belongs. For now, simply notice that the book refuses to remain a spectator sport. It keeps holding up a mirror, and mirrors, unlike windows, have an uncomfortable way of showing you your own face. So carry the map with you into what comes next. We have watched a young man refuse a plate and in doing so refuse an entire system's claim on his soul. We have seen that the smallest act of faithfulness can open the largest of doors. And now we know the secret architecture of the book and the single thread that holds it together. Everything is in place. The captives are positioned, the pattern is set, and the first of the great dreams is about to arrive, dropped into the mind of a sleeping king who will wake up terrified, unable to remember what he saw, and desperate enough to threaten the lives of every wise man in his kingdom to get it back. The human drama is over. The visions begin now, and they arrive on the terms of a man who has everything to lose, which is precisely why nobody will be able to accuse him of flattery. What that terrified king dreamed and what it cost to unlock it turns the entire empire upside down, and it starts with a single impossible demand that no advisor in the world could survive. That is where we go from here. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, in the dead of night. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on the planet, and a person not remotely accustomed to losing sleep over anything, jolted awake from a dream so vivid and so disturbing that he could not shake it loose. Something in it had rattled him down to the foundations, some image his mind flatly refused to release, and by the time morning came he was a wreck, pacing the palace, haunted by a vision he could feel pressing on him but could no longer fully see. So he did what powerful men have always done when they are frightened and will not admit it. He called in the experts. Babylon kept an entire professional class devoted to precisely this kind of problem. A well-established guild of magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and assorted dream readers whose whole career consisted of explaining the mysterious to the powerful. This was a respectable and generously compensated line of work, the ancient equivalent of an expensive consulting firm, and its members had presumably grown very comfortable indeed. The king has a dream, the experts gather round, someone flips through the appropriate scrolls, everyone nods gravely, a suitably flattering interpretation is produced, and the invoices go out on time. It was a reliable arrangement. Right up until the morning, Nebuchadnezzar decided to rewrite the terms of service. Because the king, whether from genuine suspicion or simply a foul mood, made a demand that landed on the assembled wise men like a bucket of cold water, he would not tell them the dream. They would tell him. First, they would reveal to him exactly what he had dreamed, down to the details, and only then would they interpret it. And should they fail, he would have them all executed and their houses turned to rubble, which is an unusually motivational approach to a staff meeting. The experts, understandably, felt this was a bit much. Now buried in this outrageous demand was a genuinely shrewd piece of reasoning, and it is worth pausing on because it exposes exactly how the whole racket worked. Anyone with a bit of nerve and a good vocabulary can invent an interpretation for a dream once you have described it to them. That is the easy part, the part these professionals had built entire careers on. But to reveal the dream itself, the private images inside another man's sleeping head, that requires actual contact with something beyond human reach. Nebuchadnezzar had, perhaps without fully realizing it, designed a perfect fraud detector. He was separating the ones who were truly in touch with the divine from the ones who were simply very good at telling powerful people what they wanted to hear. And the instant real verification was required, the entire industry collapsed like a folding chair. The magicians protested that no king had ever asked such a thing, that it was impossible, that only the gods could reveal such a secret, and the gods, they added rather unhelpfully, do not live among mortals. Which was, of course, accidentally the most honest thing they said all day. They were entirely correct that only a god dwelling among his people could pull this off. They simply had no idea that exactly such a person happened to be standing a few rooms away, quietly minding his own business, and about to have a very eventful afternoon. There is a connection tucked into this scene that reaches all the way to the end of the story, and it grows out of the king's suspicion rather than his cruelty. Nebuchadnezzar refused to trust the confident voices that just told him what he wanted to hear. He demanded proof only the real thing could produce. And that instinct, oddly enough from a pagan tyrant, is exactly the instinct Jesus urged on his own followers for the last days. He warned that as the end approached, false teachers and false prophets would not trickle in, but flood in, smooth and persuasive and utterly convincing, offering comfortable messages to anyone willing to pay in loyalty. The counsel, echoed later by his apostles, was not to swallow every confident claim, but to test the spirits, to check the fruit, to ask whether the impressive voice can actually produce what only God can produce. The Babylonian dream readers are the pattern of every hollow authority that sounds authoritative right up until you ask it to deliver something real. Nebuchadnezzar, of all people, models the discernment the faithful will need most when the noise gets loudest. It is worth marveling, too, at where this whole revelation chose to begin. God did not send the dream to Daniel, his faithful servant. He sent it to Nebuchadnezzar, a proud pagan king who did not know him, did not serve him, and would cheerfully have executed anyone who suggested he should. And yet it was into that man's sleep that the future of the world was quietly poured. It is a striking reminder that no one sits beyond the reach of the God of heaven, not even the emperor who is certain he answers to nobody. The most powerful skull on the planet was invaded in the night by a message it could neither summon nor silence, which is a humbling thought for anyone who imagines their position places them above such interruptions. Heaven, it turns out, does not require your permission to get your attention. The king's patience, never his strong suit, ran out entirely. He issued a decree that all the wise men of Babylon were to be put to death. And here is where our 4 young captives get swept into a disaster they had nothing to do with. Daniel and his 3 friends were officially counted among the wise men of the realm, which meant that when the soldiers went out to carry out the sentence, their names were on the list too. They had not been consulted about the dream. They had not stood in that room. and they were about to be executed for failing a test they were never given, which is precisely the sort of bureaucratic efficiency you get when a furious king stops distinguishing between the guilty and the merely nearby. And here the contrast that runs through this whole book snaps sharply into focus. The professional wise men, the credentialed experts of the empire, had responded to the crisis with panic and excuses. Daniel, the young foreigner, responded with composure. He went to the officer carrying out the executions and asked with real tact for a little time, promising the king an answer. Then he did the one thing none of the panicking professionals had thought to try. He went home, gathered his 3 friends, and prayed. He asked the God of heaven for mercy concerning this mystery, so that the 4 of them would not be swept away with the frauds. While an entire guild of experts wrung their hands, 4 captives quietly asked heaven for help. It is not a subtle comparison. That night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And notice what he did first, because it tells you everything about him. He did not race off to the palace to save his own skin. He stopped and worshipped. He blessed the God of heaven, praising him as the one who changes the times and the seasons, who removes kings and sets up kings, who gives wisdom to the wise and reveals deep and hidden things. Which, if you are paying attention, is a rather large hint about what the dream turns out to be about. Before Daniel explained a single image to anyone, he had already named the theme in his prayer. This is a God who installs and uninstalls kingdoms at will, and the dream is about to prove it on a scale that spans the whole future of the world. Standing at last before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel did the thing that separates him from every flatterer who had come before. He refused to take the credit. No wise man, no enchanter, no magician could reveal the secret, he told the king plainly. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has chosen to show the king what is coming. It would have been so easy to let the king believe Daniel himself was some kind of genius, to bask in the moment, to bank the prestige. Instead, he pointed straight past himself to God. Keep that gesture in mind, because it is the quiet engine underneath everything good that happens to this young man. Then he described the dream, and it was a monster. Nebuchadnezzar had seen an enormous statue, a colossus of a man, dazzling and frankly terrifying to look at. Its head was fashioned of pure gold. Its chest and its 2 arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron. And its feet were a strange, unsettling mixture, part iron and part baked clay, the 2 materials crammed together in a way that never quite bonds. From head to toe, the statue descended through metals, and each metal carried a meaning. The interpretation was history written before it happened. Each section of the statue, Daniel explained, was a kingdom, and the kingdoms would arrive in sequence, one after another, marching down the centuries in the order the metals appeared. The golden head was Nebuchadnezzar himself and his Babylon, the reigning superpower, the head of gold. After him would rise a second kingdom, the silver, inferior to his own. After that, a third, the bronze, which would rule over the whole earth. And then a fourth, the iron, strong and crushing and brutal. A kingdom that would smash and shatter everything in its path the way iron breaks softer things. And finally, those unsettling feet, iron mixed with clay, a last phase of that 4th kingdom that would be partly strong and partly brittle, a thing that could not hold itself together, iron and clay refusing to fuse no matter how hard anyone pressed them. Read across the centuries, the sequence lines up with the great empires that actually followed. Babylon gave way to the Medes and the Persians, the 2 arms of silver. The Persians gave way to the Greeks under a young conqueror who really did sweep across the known world in the bronze middle of the statue. And the Greeks gave way to the iron of Rome, which crushed and broke and swallowed everything with a thoroughness the earlier empires could only have admired. And that brittle mixture in the feet points to a final, unstable version of that same iron system, a kingdom trying to bind together pieces that will not stay bound, which becomes enormously important when we reach the darker visions later on. There is a quietly hilarious detail in the metallurgy that most people breeze right past. As you travel down the statue, the metals get less valuable. Gold, then silver, then bronze, then iron cut with common clay. But as the value drops, the hardness rises, at least until the crumbling feet. In other words, the empires got cheaper and meaner as history rolled on, trading glory for brute force, until the whole thing rested on feet of literal mud. Picture the engineering for a moment, a towering giant with the most precious material at the very top and a foundation of half-baked clay at the very bottom. Any builder in any century would take one look and quietly back out of the room. A structure like that is not standing on stability. It is standing on borrowed time, and it knows it. The precision of this lineup is, frankly, part of why the book has been argued over for centuries. The metals map onto the actual march of empires with such uncomfortable accuracy that skeptics have long insisted the whole thing must have been written after the fact, because surely no one could call the shots that cleanly in advance. Believers naturally draw the opposite conclusion and see exactly the kind of specificity you would expect if the future really had been laid open. We will not settle that argument here, but it is worth noticing that the book itself seems entirely unbothered by the scrutiny. It makes concrete, checkable claims about the sequence of world powers and practically dares history to prove it wrong, which is not the behavior of a text hoping no one looks too closely. Vagueness hides, Daniel names names, and that leads straight into a connection with something Jesus himself would say centuries later. Describing the long stretch of history before the end, he spoke of nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom, of wars and rumors of wars, of a world that would look to anyone living through it like pure chaos. But the dream reveals the secret hiding underneath all that chaos. The rise and fall of these empires, the endless churn of conquest and collapse that fills the history books, was not random at all. It was mapped. The whole sequence was laid out in advance, in order, in a single image, long before any of it happened. What feels from the inside like the world spinning out of control is, from a higher vantage point, a script unfolding exactly on schedule. History is not a runaway train. It is a train on rails, and someone drew the route. Nebuchadnezzar's response was extraordinary, and it is the first great illustration of the thread we are tracking. The most powerful human being on earth, the head of gold himself, fell flat on his face in front of a young foreign captive. He, the conqueror of nations, prostrate before a prisoner of war. He honored Daniel, and more importantly, he acknowledged Daniel's God as the God of gods, the Lord of kings, the revealer of secrets. For one shining moment, the proudest man alive bowed low, and a captive was lifted high, which is a preview in miniature of a day the scriptures promise is coming, when every knee, from the greatest ruler to the least beggar, will bow before the true king, willingly or otherwise. And then came the promotions. Daniel was made ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and set as chief over all its wise men, a stunning reversal for a young man who, that same morning, had been on a list to be executed. And he did not forget his friends. At his request, the three who had prayed beside him were placed over the affairs of the province as well. There it is, the first clear mark on the hidden thread, the one I asked you to start tracking. 4 humble captives who grasped for nothing and prayed for mercy end the day higher than they began it. File that away. We are counting. Now, I have told you almost the entire dream, but I left something out, and I left it out on purpose. There was one more image in that vision, the single most important thing Nebuchadnezzar saw, and it made every ounce of that gold and silver and bronze and iron completely beside the point. It is the part that most retellings rush past on their way to the next exciting story, and it deserves far better than that. It deserves its own moment. So let us go back into the dream and look at the thing that brings the whole glittering giant crashing down. Picture the Colossus once more standing there in the king's sleeping mind, magnificent and doomed. And now watch what enters the frame. While Nebuchadnezzar was still staring up at this dazzling monument to human power, a stone appeared. Just a stone, not forged, not cast, not carved. It was cut out of a mountain by no human hand, quarried by no one, shaped by no tool, and it arrived completely uninvited, small and plain and utterly unimpressive next to the towering statue it was about to meet. If the Colossus was the most impressive object in the vision, the stone was easily the least, which is exactly the point. The stone struck the statue, and it struck it precisely at its one fatal weakness, the feet of iron and clay. And the entire thing came down, not just the feet, not just the bottom section, but everything all at once. The gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the whole towering assembly of the world's greatest empires shattered in a single instant and crumbled into dust so fine that the wind simply carried it away, scattered like chaff blown off a threshing floor at harvest, until there was nothing left. No rubble, no ruins, no trace at all, as if the mightiest kingdoms in the history of the earth had never so much as existed. And where the statue had stood, the little stone began to grow. It swelled into a mountain, and the mountain kept growing until it filled the whole earth. Daniel's interpretation of this final image is the beating heart of the entire book. In the days of those last kings, he explained, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom of his own, and this one will be different from all the others in the one way that matters most. It will never be destroyed, it will never be conquered and handed off to another people the way Babylon was handed to Persia and Persia to Greece. Instead, it will break every one of those other kingdoms into pieces and bring them to a permanent end, and it alone will stand forever. Every empire in the dream had an expiration date stamped on it. This one has none. There is a quiet richness in the image of that stone swelling into a mountain, because mountains carry a particular weight in this kind of literature. All through the scriptures, a mountain is where God meets his people, the high and immovable place bound up with his presence and his rule. So when the stone grows into a mountain that fills the entire earth, it is not merely getting larger. It is a picture of God's reign spreading until it covers everything, every land, every people, every corner the old empires used to fight over. The kingdoms of the statue were regional, each grabbing its slice of the map before losing it to the next in line. The mountain takes the whole map and then it keeps it. Where the empires divided the earth among themselves and squabbled over the borders, the kingdom simply fills it, wall to wall, with no rival left to carve out a share. This is the hope planted right in the middle of the horror, and it is worth naming for what it is. So much of this book is heavy. It is beasts and judgment and persecution and proud kings and coming tribulation. But here, at the very threshold of the visions, before any of the darkness arrives, the book plants a flag and refuses to let you forget it. However bad the story gets, and it will get dark, this is how it ends. Not with the statue, with the stone, not with the empires, with the mountain. Every horror that follows is playing out under the shadow of a guaranteed conclusion, which changes how you read all of it. The contrast between the two builders could not be sharper, and it is the whole lesson in a single picture. Human beings build upward. We build with metal and clay and engineering and armies and gold. We stack our achievements as high as we can, we make them gleam, and we tell ourselves they will last, and they are undeniably impressive. The statue was a genuine marvel, but it was top-heavy, brittle-footed, and temporary, doomed from the moment it was raised. God builds differently. He builds with a single stone no human hand ever touched, something plain and small and easy to overlook. And it turns out to be the one thing in the entire vision that cannot be broken. The empires took centuries to rise. The stone needed roughly 1 second to finish them. There is a whole theology hiding in that ratio. And do not rush past the strange little detail that the stone was cut by no human hand, because it carries more than it first appears. Everything else in the vision was manufactured. The statue was engineered, alloyed, assembled, the product of human craft and ambition piled as high as it would go. The stone was not made by anyone. It came from outside the whole system of human effort, unquarried, unshaped, arriving under its own authority rather than by anyone's labor. That is the book's quiet way of insisting that the final kingdom is not something people build. We do not assemble it through better governments or grander projects or the slow perfecting of civilization. It comes from elsewhere, given rather than achieved, which is either wonderful news or mildly irritating news depending on how attached you are to the idea of constructing your own road to paradise. The stone does not need our help, it never did, and notice how the kingdom arrives because this is Daniel's own picture of what later generations would call the second coming, told in the language of a dream. The stone does not slowly erode the statue over the course of a few thousand years. It does not negotiate with the feet or convert the iron a little at a time or gradually reform the colossus into something better. It strikes and it is over. This is not a vision of the world being patiently improved until it quietly turns into the kingdom of God. It is a vision of sudden, decisive impact, a single intervention from outside that brings the entire human construction down in one blow and replaces it with something that lasts. The world does not gently become the kingdom. The kingdom arrives and ends the world's long, doomed building project. The stone is the king, and the strike is his return, which leaves every single person watching the dream with exactly one question, and it is not a comfortable one. Everything in that vision is either part of the statue or part of the stone. There is no third option, no neutral ground, no place to stand that is neither. The statue is glorious and human and impressive, and it is coming down. The stone is plain and divine and overlooked, and it is standing forever. So the dream, for all its ancient strangeness, ends by quietly turning to face the person reading it and asking which one you are building your life on. Are you invested in the statue, in the gold and the power and the towering human achievement that photographs so well and lasts so poorly? Or are you standing on the stone, the unimpressive, unbreakable thing that outlives all of it? The dream does not answer for you. It just makes very sure you cannot pretend the question was never asked. This is why this stop on our journey matters so much, because it is the optimistic anchor the whole book is tethered to. The visions ahead get grim. There are beasts rising out of the sea, arrogant horns making war on the faithful, seasons of tribulation, and a final ruler more terrible than any that came before. It would be easy to sink under all of it, but the stone is already in the water, so to speak. Before a single beast appears, the ending has been shown, and the ending is good. The mountain fills the earth. The king wins. Everything that follows, however dark, is a story with a settled last page, and you have already read it. Now Nebuchadnezzar had just been handed the most staggering revelation of his life. He had watched, in a dream, his own kingdom reduced to the top slice of a doomed statue, followed by a stone that erases every empire, including his own. You might think a man would take a lesson like that to heart. You might think he would walk away humbled, chastened, perhaps a little quieter about his own permanence. You would be giving him far too much credit, because the very next thing the king does, once the awe of the dream has worn off, is build a statue of his own. And here is the detail that turns the whole episode into a study in stubbornness. In the dream, only the head had been gold, and the gold head meant Babylon, glorious but temporary, destined to be replaced by silver and bronze and iron, and finally erased by a stone. So Nebuchadnezzar built an enormous image, and he made the entire thing gold. Not just the head, all of it. Head to foot, solid gold, no silver, no bronze, no iron, and absolutely no clay feet, thank you very much. It was, in the most literal sense possible, a monument of denial. It was the king looking at a divine message that said your kingdom will end, and replying, in about the pettiest way imaginable, no, it will not. Watch me build it out of gold from top to bottom and see if you can knock that down. Subtlety, as we have established, was not among his gifts. The image was colossal, plated in gold, and set up on a wide plain for maximum visibility. Then the king summoned every official, governor, and administrator in the empire and issued a decree with all the flexibility of a slamming door. When the royal orchestra struck up, every person present was to fall down and worship the golden image. And anyone who refused, anyone who stayed standing, would be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. There was no appeals process. The choice was bow or burn, and the music was the starting gun. The logic behind it was cold and effective. A single mandatory object of worship is an administrator's dream, if you will pardon the word. It unifies a sprawling, diverse empire under one visible act of loyalty. It makes allegiance testable at a glance, because in a crowd of thousands all bowing in unison, the one person left standing might as well be holding a sign. One image, one bow, one moment, and the king can see exactly who is with him and who is not. Forced unity is simply easier to govern than genuine diversity, and every empire eventually discovers this and reaches for it. This is where we hit one of the cleanest connections in the entire book, so clean it is almost startling. The book of Revelation describes, among the horrors of the final days, an image of the beast. A second figure, a false prophet, will construct an image in honor of the world ruler, give it the appearance of life, and force the entire population of the earth to worship it on pain of death, refusing no one and excusing no one. Lay the two scenes side by side, and they are nearly the same photograph taken thousands of years apart. A supreme human authority, a mandatory golden image. Worship demanded of everyone, a death sentence for anyone who will not comply. Nebuchadnezzar's plane is a small-scale rehearsal for the whole planet's final exam. And watch the flow of glory, because it matters in both cases. When the crowds bowed to the golden image, the worship did not stop at the statue. It flowed straight through the image to the king who had built it. The image was never the real object of devotion. It was a collection point, a funnel that gathered the loyalty of the masses and poured it toward the throne. So it will be at the end. The worship demanded by the image of the beast is not really about the image. It flows past it to the ruler standing behind it, gathering the allegiance of the world and pouring it toward one man who has always wanted exactly that. The image is just the machinery. The king is the destination. Into this vast, obedient, terrified crowd stand three men who will not bend. You have met them already, though not by these names. They are Daniel's three friends, the ones who prayed beside him and rose beside him. And by now Babylon knew them by the names it had stamped on them during their re-education: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When the music played and the entire plane dropped to the ground in a single rippling motion, three figures remained upright, plainly visible, impossible to miss. Where Daniel himself was during all this, the record does not say. Perhaps he was away on the business of the province he now governed. Whatever the reason, his three friends faced this particular fire without him. They did not stay standing for long before they were reported, because an empire like this never lacks for eager informers. Certain officials, quietly delighted at the chance to bring down the foreigners who had risen above them, hurried to the king with the news that three of his appointees were refusing to worship. It is the first appearance of a pattern that will return with the lions, the way faithfulness at the top always seems to attract jealous eyes looking for a way to pull it down. The three were dragged before Nebuchadnezzar, whose good mood evaporated on the spot. He gave them one final chance, which was more mercy than the decree strictly required, though he ruined it with a taunt. Bow when the music plays, he told them, or go straight into the furnace, and then he added the line that reveals the whole state of his heart. And what God, he sneered, could possibly rescue you from my hand? He had apparently already forgotten the God who read his own dreams. Pride has a remarkably short memory. The answer the three gave him is one of the bravest things any human being has ever said, and it is the true center of this whole chapter. They told the king they did not even need to defend themselves on the matter. If it came to it, the God they served was fully able to rescue them from the blazing furnace, and he would deliver them from the king's hand. But then came the words that separate real faith from a mere bet on a good outcome. Even if he does not, they said, even if no rescue comes, even if we walk into that fire and never walk out, know this: we will still not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. Their obedience was not a transaction. They were not being faithful because heaven had guaranteed them a happy ending. They were prepared to be faithful whether they lived or died, because loyalty to God was never conditional on God doing what they wanted. That small phrase, even if he does not, is the difference between faith and negotiation, and it is a large part of why these three have been remembered for thousands of years. The king lost whatever composure he had left. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, which was a pointlessly theatrical gesture, since an ordinary furnace was already more than equal to the task. But rage has never been especially good at arithmetic. The heat became so ferocious that the soldiers assigned to carry the 3 men up to its mouth were overcome by it before the prisoners even went in. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, still bound hand and foot, dropped into the heart of the flames. And then Nebuchadnezzar, watching from a safe distance, shot to his feet in alarm. Something was wrong with the count. He had thrown 3 men into the fire, bound. But now he saw 4 walking around loose in the middle of the flames, unbound, unhurt, entirely at ease, as though they were strolling through a garden rather than an inferno. And the 4th figure, he said, looked like a son of the gods. God had not answered their faith by keeping them out of the furnace. He had answered it by climbing in with them. The rescue was not from the fire, it was inside the fire. He called them out, and they walked from the flames, and the inspection that followed borders on the comic in its thoroughness. The officials and governors crowded around to examine the 3 men, and they could find nothing. Not a single hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were not scorched. Their skin was unharmed. And then the detail everyone remembers, the one that seals it, they did not even smell of smoke. The only thing the fire had managed to accomplish, in all its 7 times fury, was to burn away the ropes that had bound them. The flames consumed their chains and left everything else untouched. The one gift the furnace gave them was freedom. Linger on that fourth figure for a moment because he changes the whole meaning of the rescue. God had every option available to him. He could have kept the 3 men out of the furnace entirely, struck the king down, or snuffed out the flames before anyone was bound. He did none of those things. He let them be thrown in, and then he met them at the bottom. The deliverance was not from the fire, but through it, with a divine companion walking beside them in the middle of the worst moment of their lives. That is a very particular kind of comfort, and not the kind we usually think to ask for. We tend to pray that the fire be taken away. This scene gently suggests that sometimes the fire stays, and the far greater miracle is who chooses to show up inside it with you. The presence in the flames mattered more than the absence of flames ever could have. This scene is a preview of one of the more astonishing episodes still waiting at the end of the story. Revelation describes 2 faithful witnesses who will stand against the beast in the final days, proclaiming the truth while the whole world hates them for it. They will be killed for their defiance, their bodies left exposed for a watching world to gloat over. And then, in full public view, God will raise them back to life and take them up, so that everyone who mocked them has to watch them vindicated. The shape is exactly the same as the furnace. The faithful refuse to bow. They are handed over to death by a system that demands worship. And God delivers them so visibly, so undeniably, right in front of the very authority that condemned them, that no one can pretend it did not happen. Public faithfulness met with public rescue. Nebuchadnezzar, true to form, spun on a dime. The man who had sneered what God could save you now issued a fresh decree declaring that anyone in his entire empire who spoke a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be destroyed, because, he announced, no other God can rescue like this. His theology remained a work in progress, but at least the direction was improving. And underneath the king's whiplash conversion sits the deepest reversal of all. The one that runs all the way to the end of time. Under the rules of the empire that morning, the only safe people were the ones who bowed to the image, and the faithful were the ones marked for the fire. Worship the golden thing and live, refuse it and burn. But that arrangement, the book quietly insists, is temporary and in the end completely inverted. Revelation shows the final scene, and in it the tables have turned all the way over. It is those who worship the beast and bowed to its image, those who chose the safe and easy bow to save their own skin, who face the reckoning in the end. And it is the ones who refused, the ones who suffered, the ones who were willing to walk into the furnace rather than compromise, who are found standing and vindicated when the smoke finally clears. The fire changes sides. The heat that fell on the faithful in this life falls in the end on the system that lit it. Everyone who ever endured a furnace for refusing to bow will, one day, watch that justice arrive. And once again, the thread. The 3 men who would not bend, who were prepared to die rather than worship, do not merely survive. They are promoted. The king raised them to even higher positions in the province of Babylon, lifting the very men an empire had just tried to incinerate. That is the second clear mark on our hidden thread, and it is pointing in exactly the same direction as the first. The proud king humbled himself, and the humble captives were exalted. 2 marks now, both pointing the same way. Keep counting because the count is starting to mean something, and keep watching this particular king because the man who just built a golden monument to his own permanence, who dressed up his refusal to die in solid gold, is about to discover in the most personal and humiliating way imaginable just how temporary a proud man really is. The lesson arrived, as it so often does with proud men, dressed as another dream. Sometime after the furnace, when Nebuchadnezzar had settled comfortably back into believing himself the center of the universe, he went to sleep one night and saw a tree. Not an ordinary tree, an enormous one. A colossus of timber standing at the very center of the earth, so tall its top pierced the sky and so wide it could be seen from every corner of the world. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and beneath its branches every beast of the field found shade while every bird of the air nested in its boughs. All living things drew their food from it. It was, in short, the perfect picture of a ruler at the absolute peak of his power, the great provider under whose shadow the whole world sheltered. And you can imagine how flattering that must have felt, right up until the next part. because down from heaven came a holy watcher, an angelic messenger, and he did not admire the tree. He pronounced a sentence on it. Cut it down, he ordered. Strip its leaves, scatter its fruit, drive out the animals sheltering beneath it. Leave only the stump in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze out in the grass of the field. And then the decree turned strange and personal, sliding from talking about a tree to talking about a man. Let his mind be changed from a man's mind, the watcher said, and let him be given the mind of a beast, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The purpose was spelled out plainly so that the living would know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he wishes. In other words, this was a lesson about who is actually in charge, and the tree was not going to enjoy it. Nebuchadnezzar woke up rattled again and summoned Daniel again, because at this point his own professional dream readers had a perfect track record of being useless, and even he had noticed. And here we see something lovely about Daniel that is easy to miss. When he understood the dream, he was troubled by it. He did not rub his hands together with satisfaction at the thought of his captor being humbled. He was genuinely distressed, and he actually hesitated, and he told the king he wished the meaning applied to the king's enemies instead. This is a man who had every earthly reason to resent Nebuchadnezzar, the conqueror who had destroyed his homeland and dragged him into exile, and instead of gloating, he grieved. There is a quiet nobility in that which the story does not underline but clearly wants you to see. Then he delivered the interpretation as gently as such news can be delivered. You are the tree, he told the king. You have grown great, your greatness reaches to heaven, your dominion to the ends of the earth. But you are going to be cut down. You will be driven away from human society, you will live with the wild animals, you will eat grass like an ox, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. And this will go on for 7 periods of time, until you learn the one lesson you have refused to learn, that heaven rules and you do not. And then Daniel did something remarkable. He offered the king a way out. Break off your sins, he urged him. Show mercy to the oppressed, change your ways, and perhaps this sentence can be delayed. It was not a fixed doom, it was a warning with a door left open. The king was being given time, and time specifically of a full year. For 12 entire months, nothing happened. Nebuchadnezzar had a year to take the warning to heart, a year to humble himself even slightly, a year in which the dream must have faded into the background of a busy imperial schedule, which tells you everything about how seriously he took it. Given a full year of grace, he apparently used it to do absolutely nothing, which is the most human response imaginable to a warning that has not come true yet. We are all excellent at ignoring consequences that have been kind enough to delay themselves. Then came the rooftop. 12 months later, the king was walking on the roof of his royal palace, surveying the great city sprawled beneath him, the walls and the gardens and the temples and the gleaming avenues, and pride swelled up in him like a tide. Is this not great Babylon, he said to himself, which I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Count the possessive pronouns in that sentence. I built it by my power for my glory. 3 claims of ownership crammed into one boast, and not a single mention of the God who had told him in vivid detail, exactly 1 year earlier, what happens to men who talk like that. The timing could not have been worse if he had scheduled it. The words were still in his mouth when the sentence fell. A voice came from heaven announcing that the kingdom had departed from him, and in that instant his reason left him. The most powerful man on earth was driven out from human company and began to live like an animal in the open field. He ate grass like cattle. His body was soaked with dew. His hair grew long and matted like feathers, and his nails grew out like the claws of a bird. The head of gold, as we might call him, was reduced to grazing in a meadow, and this went on, as promised, for 7 long periods of time. There is no way to describe this that is not deeply undignified, and the text does not try to soften it. The man who had insisted his kingdom was so permanent he built the whole statue out of gold, spent years unable to remember he was a person. It would be easy to make this grimly funny, and there is a certain terrible irony in it, but the story is not actually mocking his suffering. It is making a point about the distance between what a proud man believes about himself and what is true. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was a god who happened to wear a crown. He was, it turned out, a creature entirely dependent on a mind that could be switched off in an instant by the god he ignored. Everything he had boasted of, his power, his glory, his sanity itself, was on loan, and loans eventually get called in. But here is the turn that makes Nebuchadnezzar so unusual among the proud men of this book, and it comes in a single gesture. At the end of the appointed time, he lifted his eyes toward heaven. That is the whole hinge of his story, that upward look. For years he had looked down at his city, at his subjects, at his own reflection in the shine of his achievements. And the moment he finally looked up, away from himself and toward the God above him, his reason returned. He blessed the Most High. He honored the one who lives forever, whose dominion is everlasting, and whose kingdom endures from generation to generation, before whom all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. He confessed out loud that heaven rules. And having learned the lesson, he was restored, not merely to his former position, but to even greater majesty than before. The tree was allowed to grow back. There is one more astonishing thing about this whole episode that is easy to overlook. Much of the account of Nebuchadnezzar's downfall reads as though the king himself is telling it, as a personal testimony issued to his entire empire, in his own voice, confessing what happened to him and exactly why. Stop and consider how extraordinary that is. The most powerful man on earth did not bury the story of the years he spent grazing in a field like an animal. He published it. He turned his single most humiliating memory into an open proclamation, so that everyone under his rule would know that the God of heaven had brought him low and then lifted him back up. That is the surest sign the lesson actually took. A proud man hides his shame. A humbled man broadcasts it, because he has finally understood that the point was never his dignity in the first place. It was the truth about who really runs the world. This is why Nebuchadnezzar sits at the very center of the book in the mirror section we mapped out earlier, paired against another king we are about to meet. He is the rare example of pride that is broken and then healed, because the man underneath finally bent. He is proof that the humbling is not cruelty for its own sake. It is meant to save. The whole miserable ordeal in the field existed to bring one arrogant man to the one posture that could rescue him. Looking up instead of down, he came out of it lower and therefore, by the strange arithmetic of this book, higher than he had ever been. And that carries a warning tucked inside it that reaches all the way to the end of time because of when the blow fell. Nebuchadnezzar was caught at the exact peak of his self-satisfaction, mid-boast, on a beautiful afternoon, with no warning that this particular stroll on the roof would be the last coherent thought he had for years. He was completely unprepared, precisely because everything felt so secure. And that is the pattern the New Testament returns to again and again when it describes the day of the Lord. It comes suddenly, unexpectedly, when people are eating and drinking and building and boasting and assuming tomorrow will look like today. It breaks in like a thief in the middle of the night at the hour no one is watching for it, which is exactly the point of the warning. The instruction that follows is always the same: stay awake, stay ready, stay humble. Do not get caught on the roof, admiring your own kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar is the cautionary portrait of a man who was certain he had all the time in the world. Right up until the afternoon, he discovered he did not. Now hold that story in one hand, because the book immediately places a second king beside it, and the two are meant to be read together, like a before and after photograph of what pride does depending on how a man responds to it. Decades pass. Nebuchadnezzar is long dead, his lesson apparently buried with him, and the throne of Babylon eventually comes to rest with a ruler named Belshazzar, who is about to demonstrate that some families do not learn from experience so much as inherit the tendency to repeat it. Belshazzar, on what history would prove to be one of the worst possible nights for a party, threw an enormous feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in front of them all. There is a detail here that the ancient audience would have appreciated and that we tend to miss, which is that this celebration was happening while the armies of Persia were, by most accounts, already closing in on the city. Nothing radiates confidence quite like throwing a lavish banquet while a hostile empire assembles at your gates. It was the ancient equivalent of turning the music up to drown out the sound of someone kicking in the front door. Belshazzar was not worried. Babylon's walls were legendary, its defenses were the envy of the world, and he had every reason, or so he thought, to believe himself untouchable. And then, warmed by wine and by his own sense of security, he made the decision that sealed his fate. He gave orders to bring out the gold and silver vessels that had been taken long ago from the temple in Jerusalem. You may remember those vessels. They were carried off in the very first act of this whole story, hauled into Babylon as trophies to prove that Babylon's gods had beaten the God of the exiles, and I asked you at the time to keep them in the back of your mind because they had not finished their part in the story. Here they are again. Belshazzar had these sacred cups, objects set apart for the worship of the living God, brought to his drunken table, and he and his nobles and his wives drank wine from them while praising the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone. It was not ignorance. It was a deliberate, public, celebratory insult, an act of contempt aimed squarely at the God of a conquered people, performed for entertainment at a party. He was, in effect, toasting his own gods with the communionware of another and finding it hilarious. The laughter did not last. In the same hour, the fingers of a human hand appeared, with no arm and no body attached to them, and began to write on the plaster of the wall, right beside the lampstand where everyone could see. And Belshazzar, the untouchable king who feared nothing, came apart on the spot. The text is almost unkind in how thoroughly it describes his collapse. His face went pale, his thoughts terrified him, his hips went slack, and his knees knocked together. This is not the reaction of a man who believes himself in control. This is a man watching a disembodied hand write his obituary on his own dining room wall, and discovering far too late that the walls of Babylon were not the only thing he needed to worry about. He screamed for his wise men to read the writing, and in a moment that should surprise no one who has been paying attention, they could not. The professional experts of the empire, so reliably useless throughout this entire book, once again produced nothing. Not one of them could read 4 short words. It took the queen mother, who had a longer memory than the drunken young king, to remember that there was a man in the kingdom who had solved exactly these kinds of impossible puzzles for kings long dead. And so, once more, they sent for Daniel, now a very old man who had somehow outlasted everyone. Daniel came, and the first thing he did was decline the payment. Belshazzar, desperate, had promised him purple robes, a gold chain, and the rank of 3rd ruler in the kingdom if he could read the wall. Daniel told him more or less to keep his gifts and give his rewards to someone else, but that he would read the writing anyway. There is something magnificent about an old man refusing the trinkets of a king who has hours left to live, though Daniel could not have stated it quite so bluntly. He simply had no interest in being paid by a doomed throne. Then he did something the terrified king surely was not expecting. Before he read the words, he preached. He reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar, the great king before him, and told the whole story in miniature, how that king had grown proud, how his pride had cost him his sanity and his throne, how he had lived like an animal until he finally acknowledged that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. And then Daniel drove the point home like a nail. You knew all this, he said to Belshazzar. You knew what happened to him. And yet you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, you have desecrated the vessels of his temple, and you have praised gods of metal and stone that cannot see or hear or know anything, while refusing to honor the God who holds your very breath in his hand. That was the true charge, not merely pride, but pride that had a warning example sitting right there in the family history and chose to ignore it. Belshazzar did not sin in ignorance. He sinned with the lesson open in front of him. Only then did Daniel turn to the wall. 4 words had been written there: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, and their meaning was as short and final as the writing itself. Mene, numbered, meaning God had numbered the days of the kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, weighed, meaning the king had been weighed on the scales of heaven and found wanting, come up short, failed the measure. And Parsin, divided, meaning the kingdom was to be divided and handed over to the Medes and the Persians, with a bitter little pun buried in the word, because it sounded very much like the name Persia, the very empire waiting outside the walls. In 3 short words, Daniel had read out the death certificate of the most powerful kingdom on earth. Counted, weighed, divided, the party was over. That very night, the sentence was carried out. Belshazzar was killed, the city fell, and the kingdom of Babylon, the golden head of that great statue, passed out of existence and into the hands of the Medes and the Persians, exactly as a dream had predicted generations before. The mightiest empire of its age ended not with a long, heroic siege, but between one cup of wine and the next, on a night its king had chosen to spend mocking God. There is a grim footnote to how Babylon actually fell that night, and it makes Belshazzar's confidence look even more misplaced. Those legendary walls that made him feel untouchable were, by the ancient accounts, never breached at all. The Persians simply went under them. The great river running through the city became their road in, its level lowered enough for soldiers to wade along the riverbed and slip beneath the defenses while the capital was busy toasting itself. The strongest walls in the world counted for nothing because the danger did not bother knocking on the front gate. It came up through the water while the party raged on above. There is a lesson tucked in there about the kind of security that looks impregnable right up until you notice the enemy was never planning to use the door. And this is where the story reaches forward and touches the very end of the book of Revelation, because Belshazzar is a preview of a final Babylon still to come. Revelation describes a last great world system symbolized as a woman drunk on luxury and blood, seated on many waters, so confident in her wealth and her pleasure and her power that she tells herself she will never see sorrow. And that system, for all its glittering security, falls in a single hour. Suddenly, completely, without warning, the whole thing collapses in the time it takes to finish a sentence. Belshazzar is the historical rehearsal for that fall. The party that believed its walls made it untouchable ended in an instant by a verdict that had already been written while the wine was still being poured. The lesson echoes across the centuries and lands with uncomfortable weight. Wealth is not a shield. Pleasure is not a shield. Confidence is certainly not a shield. When the accounting comes due, none of it buys a single extra minute. So set the two kings side by side because that is exactly what the book wants. Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are two sides of one coin, two possible endings to the same story of pride. One was humbled and because he finally bent, was restored and even raised higher. The other was warned by the first man's example, refused to bend, and was destroyed in a night. The difference between them was not the sin. They shared that. The difference was humility, the willingness to look up, and running quietly through both stories, as always, is the other half of the pattern. Because while these proud kings rose and fell, the humble old exile kept being called in to speak the truth to power. And by the end of that terrible night, even as one empire collapsed, Daniel was honored yet again. The proud came down, the humble went up. You have watched it happen enough times now that it is no longer a surprise. It is starting to look like a law. The collapse of Babylon might have looked, from Daniel's point of view, like the end of the road. He had spent his entire long life serving the Babylonian court, rising through its ranks, advising its kings. Now that court was gone, wiped out overnight, replaced by a foreign power with no reason to trust an old official tied to the regime it had just conquered. By every ordinary expectation, this was the moment Daniel finally faded into forced retirement, or worse. New empires do not usually keep the previous administration's senior staff, and they especially do not promote them. Persia, apparently, did not read that particular rulebook. The new king, Darius, took one look at Daniel and was so impressed by the old man's competence and integrity that he set him among the 3 highest officials in the entire realm and quickly began planning to elevate him over the whole kingdom. Here was a man in his 80s, a foreigner, a holdover from a defeated empire, and the new regime could not promote him fast enough. The reason the text gives is almost funny in its simplicity. Daniel was so far superior to everyone else, so obviously trustworthy and capable, that the king could not help himself. Faithfulness, it seems, is portable. It survives the fall of empires. The kingdoms around Daniel kept collapsing, and Daniel kept rising through the rubble, which is the thread we have been tracking made visible one more time. And as reliably as night follows day, his success bred resentment. The other high officials and the regional governors did not appreciate being outshone by an elderly outsider, and they set out to find something, anything they could use to bring him down. They launched what amounted to a full investigation into his conduct, combing through his administration of the kingdom, looking for corruption, negligence, fraud, any scrap of scandal they could hand to the king. And they came up with nothing, absolutely nothing. The man was clean, He was faithful in his duties, made no errors, took no bribes, and cut no corners. His enemies were forced to admit, presumably through gritted teeth, that they would never find any grounds for a complaint against this man unless it had something to do with the law of his God. An honest official with no exploitable weaknesses is, from the perspective of people trying to destroy him, deeply inconvenient, and you can almost feel their frustration. They had audited a saint and found the books in perfect order, so they changed strategy. If Daniel's only vulnerability was his devotion to his God, then they would make that devotion a crime. And here they showed real cunning because they knew better than to attack Daniel directly. Instead, they attacked the king's vanity. They came to Darius as a delighted delegation and proposed a splendid new law, one that would surely honor his greatness. For the next 30 days, they suggested, no one in the entire kingdom should be permitted to pray to any god or petition any man except the king himself. Anyone who broke this rule would be thrown into a den of lions. Flattered, and probably not thinking too hard about the fine print, Darius signed it into law. And crucially, under the legal system of the Medes and the Persians, once such a decree was signed, it could not be changed or revoked, not even by the king who signed it. The king had just locked a door and handed away the only key without noticing he had done it. There is a streak of dark comedy in the machinery of this trap because the law the schemers used was so rigid it ended up caging the very king it was meant to flatter. The decrees of the Medes and the Persians, once signed, were famously unchangeable, a point of national pride meant to project the unshakable authority of the throne. In practice, it meant a king could make a catastrophic mistake and then be legally forbidden from fixing it, which is a strange sort of power to boast about. Darius was about to discover that he ruled an empire in which even the emperor could be trapped by his own signature, a prisoner of a system designed to make him look invincible. It is a quietly modern kind of absurdity, the ruler undone not by an enemy but by his own paperwork, and the schemers understood it perfectly. They had not merely set a trap for Daniel, they had set one for the king too, and he strolled into it while thanking them for the compliment. The trap was perfect, and it was aimed with surgical precision at the one thing Daniel would never surrender. Everyone knew Daniel prayed. It was the most predictable thing about him. And now praying to anyone but the king carried a death sentence. What did Daniel do when he learned the decree had been signed? He went home, went up to his upper room, opened the windows that faced toward Jerusalem as he always had, and got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God 3 times a day, exactly as he had done his entire life. Read that carefully because the quiet steadiness of it is the whole heart of the chapter. He did not stop and he did not hide, but he also did not escalate. He did not throw open the shutters and pray at the top of his lungs to make a point, and he did not close the curtains and pray in secret to save his skin. He simply kept doing what he had always done in the open, as though the decree were beneath his notice. His faithfulness was not a performance, and it was not a protest. It was just a habit, the deep, unshakable habit of a lifetime, and no royal signature was going to interrupt it. There is a small, tender detail in how Daniel prayed that is worth pausing on, because it says a great deal about where his heart lived. He prayed at windows that opened toward Jerusalem, toward home, toward a city he had been taken from as a boy and had almost certainly never seen again, a place that by now lay in ruins hundreds of miles away, its temple long since burned to the ground. He had spent his entire adult life in the splendor of foreign capitals, risen to the very top of 2 empires, and yet 3 times a day this old man turned his face toward a distant heap of rubble and prayed as though it were still the center of the world. Because to him it was. His body had been in Babylon for the better part of a century, but his loyalty had never once moved. He was, in the deepest sense, still facing home, and no amount of Babylonian comfort had ever managed to turn his head. There is a connection here that has grown sharper with every century, and it goes to the very nature of the trap. Daniel's enemies could only convict him by making his faith itself illegal. There was no other charge available. The only way to criminalize this man was to criminalize prayer, and that is precisely the shape of the persecution the New Testament warns is coming in the last days. The faithful will not be hunted because they have done anything wrong, because they will have done nothing wrong. They will be hunted because devotion to God will itself be treated as the crime. Jesus told his followers plainly that they would be hated by all nations for the sake of his name, not for any misdeed, but simply for belonging to him. Daniel is the working model of that promise, a man whose only offense, in the eyes of the law, was that he would not stop worshiping. When the day comes that faith becomes the accusation, this old man kneeling at his open window is the picture of how it is done, faithfully, calmly, without spectacle, without apology. His enemies, of course, had counted on exactly this. They came bursting in on him mid-prayer, caught him in the act, and hurried to the king with their evidence, framed as concern for the rule of law. And Darius, to his credit, was horrified when he realized what he had done and whom he had trapped. He had been played, and he knew it. He spent the entire rest of the day desperately trying to find a way to save Daniel, working until sunset to think of some legal loophole, some path out. But there was none. The law of the Medes and the Persians could not be undone, and his own advisors, the very men who had set the trap, cheerfully reminded him of that fact. The most powerful man in the empire was helpless, bound hand and foot by his own signature, and so, miserably, he gave the order. But watch what the king said as Daniel was led away to the den. He did not sneer, as Belshazzar might have, or mock Daniel's God. He said, almost as a prayer himself, "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." Even the pagan king had somehow absorbed the sense that Daniel's steadfast devotion might be the one thing standing between him and the lions. Then Daniel was thrown into the den, a stone was rolled over the mouth of it, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and went home to what would be the worst night of his life. Darius refused dinner, refused entertainment, and could not sleep a wink, which is a rather dramatic reversal from the man who had cheerfully signed a death warrant that morning without reading it closely. Guilt, it turns out, is an effective cure for a good night's rest. At the first light of dawn, the king was up and running to the den, and he cried out in a voice full of anguish before he even reached it, asking whether the God whom Daniel served so faithfully had been able to save him from the lions. It is a genuinely tender moment, this powerful ruler shouting a desperate question into a sealed pit at sunrise, hardly daring to hope. And out of the darkness came the old man's voice, calm as ever. "My God sent his angel," Daniel told him, "and shut the mouths of the lions so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him, and I have done no wrong to you either." He had spent the night in a pit full of the most efficient predators the ancient world could offer, and he came out of it not merely alive but composed, as though he had simply slept somewhere unusual. The lions had been fully capable of tearing him apart. That is the point that gives the scene its weight. These were not tame animals, and Daniel was not spared because the lions were not hungry, as the next few minutes would make brutally clear. He was spared because God shut their mouths. The beasts were held back by a power they could not see and could not resist, restrained an inch from the man they were built to devour. And that is a picture the whole book has been building toward, the faithful standing helpless before a literal beast, kept alive not by any strength of their own, but purely by the grace of God, who will not permit the beast to close its jaws. It is exactly the situation the faithful will find themselves in under the final beast, the Antichrist and his system, surrounded by a power fully capable of destroying them, and preserved by nothing but the hand of God holding the mouth shut. Daniel in the den is the faithful of the last days in miniature, and the message is the same for both. The beast is real, and the danger is real, and the only thing between them and the teeth is God, and that turns out to be enough. Justice, when it came, was swift and unsparing. The king had Daniel lifted out without a scratch on him because he had trusted his God. And then he turned his attention to the men who had engineered the whole scheme. The accusers who had been so eager to feed an innocent old man to the lions were themselves cast into the den, and the lions, no longer under any restraint, showed none of the mercy they had shown Daniel. The trap the schemers had dug closed over the schemers. It is one of the oldest patterns in the book. The pit dug for the righteous becoming the grave of the ones who dug it, and it points forward to a final reckoning. Revelation describes the ultimate fate of those who serve the beast and persecute the faithful, and it is not a gentle one. The judgment they intended for others falls, in the end, on themselves. The lions were a small, terrible preview of a much larger justice still to come, in which the ones who spent their power devouring the faithful discover that the appetite they fed was always going to turn on them. And underneath the drama of the rescue, do not miss the plain weapon that carried Daniel through, because it is almost embarrassingly ordinary. It was not cleverness, it was not political maneuvering, it was not even courage exactly, it was prayer. The very practice that got him thrown into the den was the source of the strength that got him out of it. Daniel survived the lions because of a lifetime spent on his knees at an open window, the daily, unglamorous habit that his enemies mistook for a weakness. And that turned out to be the most powerful thing about him. His survival tool was available to anyone, requiring no rank, no wealth, no genius, only the willingness to keep showing up before God, morning and midday and evening, whether the law allowed it or not. In a book full of dazzling visions and world-shaking empires, the thing that actually saves the hero is a man quietly talking to God 3 times a day. That is worth sitting with. Darius, transformed by what he had seen, issued a decree across his whole empire that people everywhere should tremble before the God of Daniel, the living God who endures forever, whose kingdom will never be destroyed and whose dominion has no end. Which is, if you notice, the same conclusion Nebuchadnezzar had reached the hard way generations earlier. It seems the God of heaven has a habit of introducing himself to the most powerful men on earth, one humbled king at a time. And that leaves us with a question, the one Jesus himself would raise centuries later, and it is the perfect note to carry out of this chapter. After describing a widow who refused to give up, who kept coming and kept asking and would not be worn down, Jesus asks something that has unsettled thoughtful readers ever since. When the Son of Man returns, he wondered aloud, will he actually find faith on the earth? Will there still be anyone left holding on? It is a haunting question, and Daniel is very nearly the answer it hopes for. Here was a man whose faith did not crack under comfort when he had every luxury the empire could offer, and did not crack under threat when the price of prayer was a den of lions. Across a lifetime that spanned the rise and fall of empires, through every temptation to blend in and every pressure to bow, he simply kept kneeling at that window. That is the kind of faith the question is looking for. The uncomfortable part, of course, is that the question is not really about Daniel at all. It is about whoever happens to be listening, standing at their own window, deciding whether their faith is the kind that keeps kneeling when the law says stop. Up to this point, we have watched Daniel almost entirely from the outside, the calm and capable man who strolls into throne rooms full of panicking experts and quietly reads the writing on the wall. He has been the one with the answers, the interpreter, the person other people turn to when a dream refuses to make sense. But the second half of the book turns the camera all the way around, and it is a jarring shift, because now the visions come to Daniel himself, and the unflappable interpreter is suddenly the one left pale, shaken, and sick, clutching at an angel and begging to understand what he has just seen. The man who explained everyone else's nightmares is about to start having his own, and they are considerably worse. There is a small oddity in the timeline worth flagging, because it tells you something about how this book is built. The visions in the back half did not happen after the events we have just covered. They happened during them, back in the years of the Babylonian court, before the fall of the city and the night with the lions. So the book, having marched us all the way forward through the rise and collapse of an empire, now quietly rewinds and shows us what was going on inside Daniel's head the whole time. The public story of kings and furnaces and dens was only ever the surface. Underneath it, the old man was being shown the entire future of the world, and he mostly kept it to himself. And it is worth asking why the visions came to this particular man and not to some king or priest with a grander title. The pattern of the whole book gives the answer. Daniel had spent a lifetime being faithful in things that looked small, a plate of food here, a habit of prayer there, one quiet act of integrity after another. And the reward for all of it turned out not to be a comfortable retirement, but a heavier assignment. He was handed the future of the world to carry, which is a great deal to ask of anyone, let alone an old man who had already survived exile, palace intrigue, and a night with the lions. It seems that in this book, faithfulness does not buy you a lighter load. It qualifies you for a bigger one. The people God trusts with the most are usually the ones who prove themselves when almost nobody was watching. The first of these visions arrived at night, and it opened with an image of pure chaos. Daniel saw the 4 winds of heaven churning up a great sea, whipping the waters into turmoil. In this kind of literature, the sea is not a pleasant beach getaway. It is the restless, heaving mass of the nations, the deep and frightening churn of human history out of which empires claw their way to the surface. And out of that violent water, one after another, 4 enormous beasts came climbing up. Not gods, not heroes, not noble figures. Beasts. Predators dragging themselves out of the chaos, dripping and hungry. It is worth lingering on that opening image, because the churning sea sets the tone for everything that follows. To the people who first heard this vision, the deep and stormy waters stood for the whole restless mass of humanity, the nations in perpetual turmoil, unpredictable and dangerous. And stirring that sea were the 4 winds of heaven, which is a quietly important detail. The chaos was not simply random. Even the turbulence out of which these monstrous empires arose was being agitated by forces sent from above. History might look, from down at sea level, like nothing but storm and confusion, one crisis crashing into the next with no rhyme to it. But the winds doing the stirring came from heaven, which means the churning was never as directionless as it appeared. Something was moving over the waters, even here, even in the chaos that produced the beasts. Now, if this is starting to feel familiar, it should, because we have met these 4 before. These are the same 4 kingdoms that appeared earlier as the great statue of metals, the sweep of empires running from Babylon down through the ages. The book showed them to us once already, and here it shows them again, which is exactly the mirror pairing we mapped out at the start. The 2 matching visions on the outer edges of the structure, describing the identical march of history from 2 different angles. But, and this is the part that makes the second version so unsettling, the 2 portraits could not look more different. And the difference is the whole point. The statue was magnificent. It was a towering human figure, gleaming with gold and silver and bronze, the very picture of civilization at its most impressive. That is how empires like to see themselves, and how they like to be remembered, as monuments, as achievements, as glory cast in precious metal. The beast vision strips all of that away. Here, the very same powers appear not as a dazzling colossus, but as a menagerie of savage animals, tearing and devouring and trampling whatever they can reach. It is the gap between the official portrait and the candid photograph. When an empire commissions its own statue, you get gold. When heaven takes the picture, you get teeth. Same kingdoms, opposite pictures, and the book wants you to understand that the beastly version is the truer one. Underneath all the marble and the ceremony, human power at its rawest is a predator that eats. The first beast was a lion, but with the wings of an eagle, the king of the animals fused with the king of the birds, the fiercest and the swiftest combined into one. That is Babylon, the golden head, at the height of its speed and strength. But as Daniel watched, the wings were torn off, and the beast was lifted up and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human heart was given to it, which is a rather touching little callback, if you think about it, to a certain proud king who was reduced to a beast in a field, and only became truly human again when he finally looked up. The lion that learned to stand like a man is Nebuchadnezzar's whole story compressed into a single image. The second beast was a bear, and it was lopsided, raised up higher on one side than the other, as though it were favoring one leg. In its mouth, clenched between its teeth, were 3 ribs, and a voice told it to get up and devour much flesh. This is the empire of the Medes and the Persians, the silver arms of the statue, and the lopsidedness captures something precise about it. It was an alliance of 2 peoples, but one of them, Persia, grew far stronger than the other, so the whole beast tilted to one side. The 3 ribs in its teeth represent the major kingdoms it swallowed on its way up. It was not a graceful animal, this bear. It was heavy, lumbering, and enormously hungry, a power that won less by brilliance than by sheer devouring bulk. The third beast was a leopard, already one of the fastest hunters alive, and this one had been given 4 wings on its back, doubling a speed that was frightening to begin with. On top of that, it had 4 heads. This is Greece, the bronze belly of the statue, and the 4 wings capture the almost unbelievable velocity of its rise, an empire that swept across the known world faster than anyone had thought possible. The 4 heads point to what happened after that lightning conquest, when the single empire fractured into 4 pieces. We will get a much closer look at that particular breakup in the next vision, so hold the thought. For now, just notice that a four-headed flying leopard is not an animal you want to meet in a dark alley or anywhere else. And then came the fourth beast, and here Daniel's language simply gives up. He could not compare it to any animal at all. It was different from all the others, dreadful and terrifying and exceedingly strong, with great iron teeth that crushed and devoured everything, and whatever it did not eat, it stamped flat under its feet. The iron teeth link it straight back to the iron legs of the statue, the Empire of Rome, and the description drips with a kind of horror the first three beasts did not carry. The lion and the bear and the leopard were at least recognizable animals. This thing was a monster with no name, a devouring machine that existed only to break and to trample. Human power, in its final and most terrible form, had stopped resembling anything found in nature. But it was what grew out of the fourth beast that mattered most. On its head were 10 horns, and as Daniel stared at them, trying to make sense of it, another horn began to push up among them, a little one at first. And as it rose, it uprooted 3 of the existing horns to make room for itself. And this little horn was different from all the rest, because it had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth, and that mouth was speaking. Speaking great things, boasting, magnifying itself, hurling arrogant words upward against the Most High himself. Out of the most terrifying beast in the vision came a small horn with a human face and a loud, blasphemous mouth, and everything in the vision now seemed to orbit around this one boastful little addition. The connection here is one the book makes almost impossible to miss, because centuries later, another exile, John, would be given a vision of a beast rising from the sea with 10 horns and a blasphemous mouth speaking against God, and it is unmistakably the same creature. This fourth beast and its little horn are the Antichrist and the global government he commands in the final days, the last and worst expression of human power set in open defiance of heaven. The boastful mouth is the signature. Every empire before it was violent, but this one adds something new, a ruler who does not merely conquer nations but stands up and curses the God of heaven to his face, convinced that nothing and no one can stop him. He talks and talks and talks, and the whole earth listens, and it seems for a while that the boasting will never end. And then the scene changes completely, and the change is the most important cut in the entire book. The camera pulls away from the noisy little horn ranting on the earth, and it lifts up into heaven, into a throne room, into a courtroom. Thrones were set in place, Daniel saw, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne was made of flames of fire with wheels of burning fire beneath it. A river of fire flowed out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood waiting before him. And then the 4 words that change everything. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. 2 small details in that courtroom deserve a second look, because they carry more than their size suggests. The first is that the text says thrones in the plural were set in place, not a single throne for the Ancient of Days alone. There are other seats in that chamber, which fits a promise woven all through the rest of Scripture, that the faithful will one day share in the judging and the reigning rather than merely watch it from a distance. The saints are not only rescued in the end, they are seated. The second detail is those open books. In a scene like this, the books are the records, the full accounting of what every person and every power actually did, kept faithfully whether anyone on earth believed they were being kept or not. Nothing the little horn boasted and nothing it destroyed went unrecorded. The court does not run on rumor, and it certainly does not run on the tyrant's own flattering version of events. It runs on the books, and the books miss nothing. Sit with the contrast for a moment, because it is the entire message of the chapter delivered in a single frame. Down on the earth, the little horn is still going, still boasting, still magnifying itself, absolutely certain of its own invincibility, drunk on the sound of its own voice. And meanwhile, without any announcement, without any drama, without the horn even noticing, a silent court has convened in heaven. And someone has quietly opened the books. The verdict is already being written while the tyrant is still mid-sentence. The most powerful figure in the vision has no idea he is already on trial. He thinks he is running the world. He is, in fact, a defendant who has not yet been informed of the charges. That is the reassurance the whole book keeps offering the faithful in 100 forms. That the boasting is loud, but it is not the last word. and the last word is being written upstairs in a room the boaster cannot see. The sentence is carried out with startling finality. The fourth beast is slain on the spot, its body destroyed and handed over to the burning flame, which is the same fiery end that Revelation reserves for the beast and the false prophet, the lake of fire. And here is a detail worth catching. The first three beasts, when their time was up, simply had their dominion taken away and were allowed to linger on for a while longer. The fourth beast gets no such mercy. It is not merely retired, it is destroyed, utterly forever, thrown into the flame. The worst of them all receives the most complete end. And then, into that fiery courtroom, comes the figure the whole vision has been building toward. Daniel saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, not crawling up out of a chaotic sea like the beasts, but descending from above, riding the clouds, arriving from heaven rather than clawing his way out of the deep. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and he was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. And his dominion, unlike every beast before it, was declared to be an everlasting dominion that would never pass away, a kingdom that would never be destroyed. 4 beasts had risen and fallen, each grabbing power by force and losing it the same way. This one did not grab anything. He was given it, and he would keep it forever. This particular image turned out to be one of the most consequential in all of Scripture, because of who later reached back and claimed it. When Jesus walked the earth, the title he used for himself more than any other, over and over, was Son of Man. And it was not a modest phrase the way it sounds to modern ears. He was reaching straight back into this vision, identifying himself as the one who comes on the clouds to receive an eternal kingdom over all the nations. And when he stood on trial for his life and the high priest demanded to know whether he was the Messiah, Jesus answered by pointing directly at this scene, saying they would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. The court understood exactly what he was claiming, which is precisely why they condemned him for it. An obscure night vision handed to an old exile in Babylon became, 6 centuries later, the load-bearing claim behind the most famous trial in history. Daniel saw the figure. Jesus said, "That figure is me." One of the attendants in the vision explained the meaning to Daniel and mercifully kept it short. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings, 4 kingdoms that rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High, the faithful people of God, will receive the kingdom and possess it forever and ever. As for the little horn, the explanation was sobering. This horn would make war against the saints and would actually prevail against them, wearing them down, for a set period described as a time and times and half a time. That phrase works out to 3.5 years, a specific and limited stretch that will surface again in the final visions and, not coincidentally, in Revelation as well. The faithful are told plainly that there will be a season when the tyrant seems to be winning, when the pressure is real and the losses are real and heaven appears to be silent. But it is a season with an expiration date stamped on it. When the appointed time runs out, the court sits, the dominion is stripped away and destroyed forever, and the kingdom is handed permanently to the people of the Most High. The war is real. The outcome is not in doubt. Daniel, for his part, did not take any of this in stride. His thoughts terrified him, his face turned pale, and he kept the whole matter locked away in his heart, unable to shake it. This is the man who had calmly read a death sentence off a wall to a room full of drunk nobles, and now he is rattled to the bone. That reaction is part of the message. These visions were not entertainment, and they did not leave the seer feeling clever or triumphant. They left him shaken because he had glimpsed something enormous, the entire arc of human power bending toward one final blasphemous ruler, and then breaking against a throne of fire. This chapter is the true hinge of the book, the bridge where the history stops and the apocalypse properly begins, where 4 ancient empires quietly become a preview of the last kingdom on earth and the eternal kingdom that ends it. Everything before was leading here, everything after is detail, and detail is exactly what the next vision provides. Because if the beast vision was a wide panorama of all of history at once, the second vision zooms in tight on just 2 of those animals and follows them in astonishing close-up. It came to Daniel about 2 years after the first, and this time he found himself in the vision standing beside a river in a place called Susa, in the province of Elam, in the region that today sits inside modern Iran. He looked up, and there by the river stood a ram with 2 horns. There is a quiet irony in where Daniel found himself standing in this vision. Susa, in the province of Elam, was not yet anything remarkable when the vision came, but it would go on to become one of the great capitals of the Persian Empire, a seat of the very power that was about to replace Babylon. So the old exile was shown in his mind's eye standing in the future headquarters of the next superpower, watching a vision about that superpower's rise and eventual fall, years before it had risen at all. He was given a tour of a capital that did not yet matter in order to be shown the downfall of an empire that did not yet exist. The vantage point alone tells you how far ahead of the calendar this book is willing to see. Both of the ram's horns were long, but they were uneven. One was higher than the other, and the taller one had come up last, growing later but rising further. This ram began charging outward to the west, to the north, and to the south, and nothing could stand against it. No other animal could resist it, and there was no one to rescue anything from its power. It did whatever it pleased, and it grew great. This, the vision would later confirm, is the empire of the Medes and the Persians, the same lopsided bear from before, seen now from a different angle. The 2 uneven horns are the 2 peoples of the alliance, and the taller horn that rose later but climbed higher is Persia, which joined the partnership second but quickly outgrew and dominated its Median partner. For a time, this ram genuinely did whatever it liked, an unstoppable force pushing its borders out in every direction. But then, from the west, something came, and it came fast. A male goat crossed the whole face of the earth so quickly that its feet did not even seem to touch the ground, and it had one conspicuous horn between its eyes. This goat came straight at the 2-horned ram in a fury, charged it with tremendous violence, shattered both of its horns, knocked it to the ground, and trampled it, and there was no one who could deliver the ram from the goat. In a single, breathtaking rush, the mighty ram was finished. That goat, flying across the earth without touching it, is one of the most accurate portraits of a historical figure in all of ancient literature, because it is Alexander the Great, and speed was the entire story of his conquest. In the space of just a few years, a young Macedonian king led his army out of the west and demolished the enormous Persian Empire, the very superpower that had spent centuries doing as it pleased. It was one of the most astonishing military campaigns in human history. An empire that had taken generations to build toppled by a 20-something in an afternoon, historically speaking. The single great horn between the goat's eyes is Alexander himself, the one conspicuous figure driving the whole thing. And the detail that its feet barely touch the ground is not poetic exaggeration. It is just an honest description of how fast this all happened. And then, at the very peak of its strength, exactly when the goat was strongest, the great horn snapped off, broken at the height of its power, and in its place 4 notable horns grew up, pointing toward the 4 winds of heaven. Here the vision captures, with almost clinical precision, what actually became of Alexander. At the absolute summit of his success, master of the largest empire the world had yet seen, he died young, still in his early 30s, having conquered nearly everything and prepared for almost nothing that came after. He left no capable heir and no succession plan, which, for a man who had thought of everything on the battlefield, was a rather large oversight. His generals fought over the corpse of his empire, and after years of squabbling, it settled into 4 major pieces, 4 kingdoms carved out of one, exactly as the 4 horns and the 4 heads of the earlier leopard had shown. The most successful conqueror in history could subdue the world but could not manage to arrange who would run it after him. There is a deeper reason the arrival of the Greeks mattered for the larger story of the Bible, beyond the drama of a young conqueror dying too soon. Alexander did not only spread his armies, he spread his culture, his language, and his ideas across the entire known world in a sweeping process later generations would call Hellenization. Greek became the common tongue of trade and learning from one end of the old Persian territory to the other, a shared language that outlasted the empire which carried it. And that turned out to matter enormously because centuries later, when the message of the gospel began to travel, it traveled along the roads and in the language this fast-flying goat had left scattered behind him. The New Testament itself would be written in Greek, the very tongue Alexander flung across the map. The goat that trampled the ram was, without the faintest idea it was doing so, laying down the linguistic highway a very different kingdom would one day use to reach the world. Out of one of those four horns the vision continued, a little horn emerged. It started small, but it grew exceedingly great, pushing toward the south and the east and toward what the text calls the beautiful land, which is the land of Israel. And this little horn grew arrogant beyond measure. It reached up toward the host of heaven and threw some of the stars down to the earth and trampled them. It magnified itself against the very prince of that host. It took away the daily sacrifice, threw down the place of the sanctuary, and cast truth to the ground, and for a while it prospered in everything it did. Here we need to add a layer of history that makes this vision land with real weight, because unlike the sweeping figure of the Antichrist, this little horn has a specific, documented, near-term fulfillment that actually happened, and its name was Antiochus IV, who styled himself Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a king of the Seleucid dynasty, one of the four kingdoms that had splintered off from Alexander's empire, and around the year 167 before Christ, he set out to do precisely what the vision described. He turned his ambition toward the beautiful land, marched on Jerusalem, and launched a campaign to stamp out the worship of the God of Israel entirely. He outlawed the faith, banned the daily sacrifices in the temple, and then committed the act that seared his name into infamy. He walked into the holy temple itself, set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus inside it, and according to the accounts, sacrificed a pig on it, deliberately choosing the single most unclean animal imaginable to defile the holiest place his subjects had. It was calculated desecration, cruelty as policy, an attempt to erase a people's god by force. There is a small, telling detail about this man that history has enjoyed a little too much. He gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means God manifest, essentially claiming to be a visible appearance of divinity walking the earth. His own subjects, who found him considerably less impressive than he found himself, quietly changed one syllable and called him Epimanes instead, which means the mad one. When even your own people are punning on your title to call you insane, the self-appointed God on earth branding is perhaps not landing the way you hoped. His arrogance provoked a revolt that eventually drove him out and cleansed the temple. But the damage and the horror he inflicted made him forever after the great historical template of what a God-defying tyrant looks like. He is the Antichrist's rough draft, the dress rehearsal, the villain history ran first so that everyone would recognize the pattern when the real one shows up. The story of Antiochus did not end with his desecration, and the sequel is worth telling because it became a celebration that survives to this day. His attempt to crush the faith by force backfired spectacularly. A family of Jewish fighters rose up in revolt against him, waged a stubborn and improbable war against a far larger empire, and against every reasonable expectation drove his forces out and reclaimed the temple. They cleansed the defiled sanctuary, tore down the altar he had corrupted, and rededicated the holy place to God. That rededication became an annual festival of lights, a yearly remembrance of the day a desecrated temple was made clean again. And here's the small, lovely detail that ties it back to everything else. Centuries later, Jesus himself is recorded walking through the temple during exactly that festival, the celebration born out of the ashes of the very desecration this vision had predicted. The prophecy, its grim fulfillment, and the festival that outlived them both, all quietly threaded together across the centuries. To help Daniel understand all this, an angel was sent, and for the first time in the book he is given a name, Gabriel, the same messenger who would one day carry the news of a coming birth to a young woman in Nazareth. Gabriel explained the ram and the goat and the horns, and then he dropped a single phrase about this arrogant ruler that is easy to skip over and impossible to forget once you catch it. This king, Gabriel said, would grow very strong, but not by his own power. Not by his own power. That short clause is the tell. Whatever strength this figure wields, it is borrowed. It comes from somewhere else, from a darker source standing behind the throne, lending its power to a human front man. The tyrant thinks he is the engine, he is only the vehicle. That short phrase, not by his own power, quietly opens a door onto something this book is about to explore far more directly. It hints that the tyrants marching through these visions are not, at the deepest level, the real story. Behind the visible king, with his armies and his corrupted altars, stands an invisible power lending him strength, a darker authority operating just out of sight. The human ruler is the face of the thing, but not its true source. This is a theme the next vision will drag fully into the open, when Daniel is shown that the struggles playing out among nations are only the earthly shadow of a far larger conflict being fought in a realm no army can reach. For now, the phrase simply plants the seed. When you watch a human power grow monstrous and God-defying, the book keeps suggesting you are usually looking at the surface of something with much deeper roots. And that is exactly where the connection reaches forward to the final little horn, the Antichrist himself. He too will grow strong, and he too will do it not by his own power, because his strength will be lent to him by Satan, the real force operating behind the human mask. He will turn that borrowed power against Israel and against the faithful, waging open war just as Antiochus did, only on a global scale and with far greater fury. But he will meet the same fate, and here the vision echoes a phrase we have heard before. He will be broken, but not by human hands. No army will defeat him. No coalition, no clever general, no human weapon. He will be shattered the same way the great statue was shattered, by a power that comes from outside the entire system of human effort, the stone cut by no human hand striking the whole structure down. The tyrant borrows his strength from below. He is destroyed by a strength that comes from above. This brings us to the single most important principle for reading the whole back half of this book, and it is the reason a chapter about an ancient Greek king matters so much to a viewer thousands of years later. It is the principle of double fulfillment. This vision had a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment folded into the same words. The near one already happened. Antiochus really did rise out of Alexander's fractured empire, really did march on Jerusalem, really did desecrate the temple and ban the sacrifices, right on schedule, exactly as described, centuries after the vision was given. That part is history now, documented and closed. But the vision reaches past him to a greater little horn still ahead, a final ruler who will do all the same things on a worldwide scale at the end of the age. One prophecy, two fulfillments, a smaller version that has already come true and a larger version still on the way. And that doubling is not just a curious literary feature, it is what makes the prophecy checkable, which is a theme this book keeps quietly insisting on. Daniel is not asking anyone to take the future on blind faith. He is pointing at a prediction and saying, watch. Part of this will come true in front of you, in real history, with names and dates you can look up. And it did. The near half unfolded with such precision that skeptics have argued about it ever since, which is itself a kind of backhanded compliment to its accuracy. So when the same vision insists there is a far half still coming, the faithful have a solid reason to take it seriously, because the pattern has already proven itself once. If the dress rehearsal was that exact, it is worth paying attention to the main performance. Every end times figure in this book, it turns out, has a historical understudy who plays the role first, in miniature, so that no one can claim they were never warned. A word of caution belongs here, though, because a book this specific tends to attract readers who become a little too specific in return. Over the centuries, plenty of people have been quite certain they could match every horn and every number to a name in their own morning headlines, and they have been, so far, remarkably consistent about turning out wrong. The double pattern is meant to give confidence, not a decoder ring for pinning down dates. Daniel himself, remember, was left shaken and baffled by these visions and had to have them explained to him, so a measure of humility suits anyone reading over his shoulder. The wiser approach is to hold the pattern loosely and the promise firmly, to trust that the shape will repeat without pretending to know the timetable. The book invites watchfulness, not arithmetic. It asks its readers to recognize the pattern when it arrives, not to circle a day on the calendar and start selling tickets. And the visions that follow are about to get even more specific, tracing kings and wars and covenants with a detail so precise that it will feel less like prophecy and more like history written slightly ahead of time. What is coming next is a countdown, an actual clock built out of years that claims to mark the arrival of the promised one down to the very era, and then a war story of northern and southern kings so exact that critics have spent lifetimes insisting it simply must have been written afterward. The book, having proven the method on Antiochus, is now going to press it to its absolute limit, and it does not flinch for a moment. It turns out the man who was shown the end of the world also read his Bible and checked the calendar like anyone else. Some years into the reign of the Persians, Daniel was studying the writings of the prophet Jeremiah, and he came across a number that stopped him cold. Jeremiah had written that the desolation of Jerusalem, the ruin of the city, and the long captivity of its people would last 70 years. And Daniel, doing the arithmetic on his own long life, realized that those 70 years were very nearly up. The clock on the exile was about to run out. Most people, handed that kind of good news, would have thrown a party. Daniel did something considerably more unexpected. He got down and prayed one of the most searching prayers of repentance in the entire Bible. And notice who he prayed as. Daniel, of all the people in this book, had the cleanest record imaginable. He had refused the king's food, kept his prayers when they were criminalized, served faithfully through the rise and fall of empires, and given God the credit at every turn. If anyone had earned the right to pray from a position of personal innocence, it was this old man. And yet when he prayed, he did not say they have sinned. He said we. We have sinned, we have done wrong, we have rebelled and turned away. He folded himself right into the failure of his whole nation, claiming no special standing, asking for mercy on the basis of God's compassion rather than anyone's good behavior. It is a small thing, but it is the thread of this whole book showing up one more time in the smallest gesture. The most righteous man in the story refused to stand above his people. He knelt down among them and said, we. And watch what he leaned his whole appeal on, because it was not the record of his people. He knew that record was indefensible. Instead, he grounded his plea entirely in the character of God, in his mercy, his faithfulness, his willingness to forgive, and above all, in his reputation, asking God to act for the sake of his own name rather than for anything the people had earned. It is the prayer of someone who has completely given up on the idea of deserving anything and has thrown himself entirely on grace. There is no bargaining in it, no reminding God of past good deeds, no list of qualifications, just a confession of failure and an appeal to a mercy that was never based on merit in the first place. It is, quietly, one of the most honest prayers in the Bible, and it is the exact opposite of the way the proud kings of this book talk to anyone. He was still praying, still mid-sentence, when the answer arrived. The angel Gabriel, whom we met explaining the ram and the goat, came to him swiftly around the time of the evening sacrifice and told him he had been sent the moment Daniel began to pray, because the old man was greatly loved in heaven. That detail is worth holding on to. The answer was dispatched at the first word of the prayer. Daniel did not know it, but heaven had already responded before he finished his sentence, which is a rather comforting thing to learn about prayers that feel like they are vanishing into the ceiling. And then Gabriel handed him a riddle made of numbers, one of the most debated and most extraordinary passages in the whole of the Old Testament. 70 weeks, he said, are decreed for your people and your holy city. Now, the word translated weeks does not mean 7 days here. It means a unit of 7, a 7 of years, so that 70 weeks works out to 70 times 7, which is 490 years. This is the prophecy's built-in unit of measurement, and once you have it, the whole thing unlocks. Gabriel was laying out a countdown of 490 years, decreed and measured, aimed at a specific set of goals. And the goals he listed were not small. Within the stretch of time, he said, transgression would be finished, sin brought to an end, wickedness atoned for, everlasting righteousness brought in, prophecy and vision sealed up, and the most holy anointed. Read that list slowly, and it stops sounding like politics and starts sounding like the entire mission of a Messiah. Ending sin, atoning for wickedness, bringing in a righteousness that lasts forever. These are not the achievements of a general or a king. They are the work of a redeemer. Gabriel was not merely predicting the rebuilding of a city. He was pointing across the centuries at the arrival of the one who would deal with the deepest problem the human race has. Then came the timetable itself, broken into pieces. From the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, Gabriel said, until the arrival of the Anointed One, the Prince, there would be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 7 weeks, which is 49 years, for the city itself to be rebuilt with its streets and walls even in troubled times. And then a further 62 weeks, 434 years, running from the rebuilt city all the way down to the appearance of the promised Anointed One. Add the two together and you get 69 weeks, 483 years, laid out as a countdown from a decree in the Persian period to the coming of the Messiah. And the arithmetic, when historians have run it, lands with uncomfortable accuracy right around the era when Jesus of Nazareth walked into Jerusalem. Centuries before he was born, an angel gave an old man in Babylon a piece of long division that pointed at the arrival of the Messiah, and it did not miss. Now, honesty requires a small footnote here, because the arithmetic of the 70 weeks has kept scholars happily arguing for a very long time. There are a few different royal decrees that might mark the starting line. The calendars of the ancient world did not always agree on the exact length of a year, and reasonable people have run the numbers in slightly different ways and landed on slightly different totals. This is not a place to be dogmatic about a single day, and anyone claiming to have pinned it down to the afternoon is probably overselling. But here is what survives all the debate intact. However you reasonably count it, the countdown runs out in the right era, the window of the 1st century, precisely when a certain teacher from Nazareth was arriving in Jerusalem. The details are disputed. The bullseye is not. The clock points unmistakably at the age of the Messiah, and that is the part that has never gone away. But the prophecy did not stop at his arrival. Gabriel added a line that must have made no sense at all to Daniel, and that would only become clear on a hill outside Jerusalem 5 centuries later. After the 62 weeks, he said, the Anointed One will be cut off and will have nothing. Cut off is not a gentle phrase. It means killed. The prophecy did not merely predict that the Messiah would come. It predicted that he would be put to death, and that he would seem in that moment to have nothing, no kingdom, no throne, no visible victory. To anyone reading it in advance, this was a contradiction. The anointed prince arrives on schedule, exactly on time, and then is executed with nothing to show for it. It would take the cross to explain how a death like that could be the whole point. This is what people mean when they call the 70 weeks the prophetic clock of human history, and it is a fitting name. What this passage insists in the plainest possible way is that history is not a random drift of events bumping into each other. It runs on a schedule. It keeps time. The arrival of the Messiah was not left to chance or to whenever things happen to work out. It was decreed, measured out in years, and set on a countdown centuries before it happened. This is one of the very few places in the Old Testament that actually dates the coming of the Christ, and it does so with a precision that feels almost out of place in a book full of dreams and beasts. Here, for once, the mysticism gives way to arithmetic, and the effect is strangely powerful. God, it turns out, is not improvising. He is keeping time, and there was one more piece, the 70th week, the final 7 years, and it is here that the clock does something unexpected. After the Anointed One is cut off, Gabriel described a coming ruler, a prince of a people who would destroy the city and the sanctuary. And this ruler would confirm a covenant, a treaty, with many for 1 week, that final 7-year period. But in the middle of that week, halfway through, he would put a stop to sacrifice and offering and set up something described as an abomination that causes desolation, a desecration of the holy place so severe it empties it of everything sacred. Notice that the 69 weeks flowed continuously down to the Messiah, but this last week stands apart, separated from the rest, as though the great clock of history paused after the 69th week and has been holding its breath ever since, waiting for that final 7 years to begin. The connection to the last days is one the book has been building toward all along. That coming ruler who makes a covenant for 7 years and then breaks it halfway through to desecrate the temple is the Antichrist. And the pattern matches everything the earlier visions described. He forges an agreement with Israel and the surrounding nations, a treaty that looks, at first, like peace and security. And then, at the midpoint, 3.5 years in, the very same span the little horn was given, he tears up the deal, halts the worship, and defiles the holy place, quite possibly with that image of the beast we met at the fiery furnace. The final week of Daniel's countdown is the 7-year climax of human history, still future, still on the clock, still waiting for the moment the great timepiece resumes ticking. God has kept perfect time on everything else in this prophecy. There is no reason to think he will be late for the last part. That strange pause in the clock, the gap between the 69th week and the 70th, turns out to be the age we ourselves are living in. When the Anointed One was cut off, the great countdown did not simply roll on into its final 7 years. It stopped, and it has been stopped ever since, holding open a long, unmeasured stretch that the earlier prophets never clearly saw, a season of grace in which the invitation goes out to the whole world before the last week begins. We are, in a very real sense, living inside the pause, in the held breath between the 69th tick and the 70th, which means the clock is not broken and it is not finished. It is simply waiting. And a pause, however long it runs, is still a pause and not a cancellation. At some point, the great timepiece resumes, but knowing the schedule is one thing. Understanding what is actually happening behind it is another. And the last vision of the book pulls back the final curtain to show Daniel the machinery underneath all of this, the part that had been hidden the entire time. It came in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, when Daniel was a very old man indeed, and it began after he had spent 3 weeks in mourning and fasting. He was standing on the bank of the great river Tigris when he looked up and saw a figure that nearly ended him on the spot. There is a human backdrop to this final vision worth sketching in because it explains the mourning. By this point, some of the exiles had begun trickling back toward Jerusalem to rebuild, and the rebuilding was not going smoothly. There was opposition, discouragement, and the slow, grinding resistance that always seems to greet anyone trying to restore something broken. Daniel, now extremely old and probably far too frail to make the journey himself, appears to have been grieving over his struggling people from a distance, which is why he had spent 3 weeks fasting and in mourning by the river. He was, in other words, praying about a real and painful situation, not sitting around waiting for a mystical experience to drop in. The overwhelming vision came to a man who was already on his knees over the troubles of the people he loved. Heaven, it seems, tends to show up where someone is already praying. A man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold, his body like gleaming stone, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and feet like burnished bronze, and his voice like the roar of a great crowd. The men who were with Daniel did not even see the figure clearly, but a terror fell on them so heavy that they fled and hid, which is a fairly reasonable response to being near something like that. Daniel was left alone, and the sight drained every ounce of strength from him. He fell to the ground, his face to the dirt, utterly overwhelmed. This unshakable old man who had faced down kings and lions without blinking was reduced to a trembling heap by a single glimpse of this messenger. A hand touched him and set him shaking on his hands and knees, and a voice told him not to be afraid, because from the first day he had set his heart to understand and to humble himself before God, his words had been heard. And then the messenger revealed something that had been happening entirely out of sight, and it is one of the most startling disclosures in the whole book. "I would have come to you sooner," he said, "but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days. 21 days. The exact length of Daniel's fast and mourning. This messenger from heaven, sent the moment Daniel began to pray, had been delayed for 3 full weeks, held up in a struggle against a hostile power identified only as the Prince of Persia. And he was not freed to continue until Michael, described as one of the chief princes, came to help him break through. Stop and let the implications of that land, because they are enormous." While Daniel stood by the river, praying and fasting, and no doubt wondering why heaven seemed so silent, an actual battle was being fought over his prayer in a realm he could not see. The delay was not indifference. It was not God ignoring him. It was a war. Behind the visible politics of Persia, behind the empires and the kings and the treaties this whole book has been cataloging, there stood invisible powers, spiritual forces attached to the nations, locked in a conflict that shadows every human conflict. The Prince of Persia was not a man. It was a dark power operating behind the throne of Persia, the same kind of unseen strength hinted at earlier when we were told a certain tyrant would grow strong, but not by his own power. Here, at last, the curtain lifts, and we see it directly. There is a war behind the war, and on the side of God's people stands Michael, named here as their special guardian, the great prince who protects them. This is a genuinely reassuring thing to learn in a book full of tyrants and beasts because it means the faithful are never actually alone against the powers arrayed against them. There is a defender in the unseen realm, and there are messengers who fight to get through, and most encouraging of all, there are prayers that set the whole thing in motion. Daniel's praying was not shouting into an empty sky. It triggered a response in heaven on the very first day and set off a 3-week struggle to deliver the answer, which means the quiet, unglamorous act of an old man kneeling by a river was, in the realm behind the realm, an event of real consequence. Your prayers may accomplish far more than you will ever be allowed to see, which is either thrilling or unnerving depending on how seriously you take the idea of being watched. This glimpse behind the curtain has to be handled with a bit of care, though, because it is easy to lurch to one of two extremes with it. Some people read a passage like this and quietly file the whole idea away as too strange to think about, carrying on as though the visible world is the only one that exists, which the book plainly insists it is not. Others swing the opposite way and become so fixated on the unseen realm that they start detecting a spiritual conspiracy behind every traffic jam and missed bus, which is exhausting for everyone involved. The book steers neatly between both ditches. It affirms that the unseen war is real and that it genuinely matters. And then it puts the emphasis not on mapping out the enemy, but on the simple, powerful act that moved heaven in the first place. Daniel did not go hunting for the Prince of Persia. He prayed and he humbled himself, and heaven did the fighting. The takeaway is not paranoia, it is prayer. Having explained the delay, the messenger then unrolled the future in astonishing detail. 3 more kings would arise in Persia, he said, and then a 4th, far richer, who would stir up everyone against Greece. And then a mighty warrior king would appear and rule with great dominion and do as he pleased, before his kingdom was broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. That warrior is Alexander again, and the 4-fold split is the same one we have already traced, so we need not linger. But from there, the messenger launched into one of the most extraordinary stretches of prophecy anywhere. A long, tangled, generation-spanning saga of 2 rival powers he simply called the King of the North and the King of the South. What follows in the vision is essentially a dynastic soap opera stretched across a couple of centuries, and it is worth appreciating the sheer messiness of it. These 2 royal houses, the northern kingdom and the southern one, spend generation after generation fighting each other over the strip of land caught between them, which happened to be the land of Israel, forever cast as the unlucky doormat between 2 feuding neighbors. There are invasions and counter-invasions, victories that dissolve into defeats, and a truly optimistic amount of diplomacy by marriage. Daughters are handed across borders to seal alliances that promptly collapse anyway, because nothing says lasting peace like a political marriage nobody in it actually wanted. Treaties are signed and broken, armies march north and then south and then north again, and the whole thing reads like an ancient feud that neither side can remember the original cause of, but both refuse to drop. The remarkable part is how precisely the vision tracks all of it, campaign by campaign, so precisely that critics have spent lifetimes insisting it could only have been written afterward, which, as we have seen, is really just the highest compliment a prophecy can receive. And out of that grinding conflict, the messenger said, a particular figure would arise, a contemptible person, someone to whom the honor of kingship was not rightly given, who would seize power not by legitimate succession, but by flattery and intrigue, sliding onto a throne that was never meant to be his. This despicable ruler would grow strong, sweep through the beautiful land, and turn his fury against the Holy Covenant. He would defile the sanctuary, abolish the daily sacrifice, and set up that same abomination of desolation, exalting himself and honoring a god of fortresses, a god of raw power that his fathers never knew. In its nearer sense, this is once again Antiochus, the historical template whose desecration of the temple we have already covered, so there is no need to walk through it a second time. But something happens in the messenger's description as it goes on, something the careful reader can feel. The portrait begins to outgrow its historical subject. The details start to stretch past anything the real Antiochus ever did, swelling into something larger, more total, more final. The contemptible king magnifies himself above every god. He speaks monstrous, unheard-of things against the God of gods. And he prospers, the messenger says, only until the appointed wrath is complete, because what has been decreed will certainly be done. This is the double pattern doing exactly what it always does, the near fulfillment quietly giving way to the far one, the ancient tyrant dissolving into the ultimate one. By the end of the description, we are no longer really looking at a Greek king from the 2nd century before Christ. We are looking at the Antichrist, the final contemptible ruler, successful and unstoppable right up until the very moment his allotted time expires. And the vision even tells us where and how he ends, which is the most pointed detail of all. This final ruler, having conquered and plundered and exalted himself beyond all measure, will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the glorious holy mountain. He marches all the way to Jerusalem, plants his command tent at the doorstep of the holy city at the very peak of his power, poised for what looks like total victory. And there, the messenger says, he will come to his end with no one to help him. Right there, at the holy mountain, at the summit of his triumph, in the exact spot where he expects to seize everything, he simply falls, alone, unaided, finished. This is the predicted defeat of the Antichrist at Jerusalem, the moment his campaign against God's people collapses at the return of Christ, undone, as the earlier visions promised, by no human hand. He gets everything he wants right up until the instant he loses all of it. The proudest ruler in all of history ends his story exactly where every proud ruler in this book has ended it, flat on the ground with the holy mountain looming over him. And that brings us to the very end of the book and to the end of everything, because the messenger's final words lift the whole story out of the parade of kings and set it down at the close of history itself. There will come a time of distress, he told Daniel, such as has never happened since there first was a nation on the earth. The great tribulation, the darkest hour the world will ever know, a stretch of trouble beyond anything in the human record. It is a heavy thing to hear. But it does not come without a promise attached, because in that same breath the messenger said that Michael, the great prince who guards God's people, will stand up. In the worst moment in history, the guardian rises. The unseen defender who fought to deliver a single prayer by a river will step forward for the whole people of God at once. The tribulation is real, but so is the one who stands up in the middle of it. And then more numbers, because this book cannot resist a countdown even at the very end. From the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination set up. The messenger said, there will be 1,290 days, and then, cryptically, a blessing on the one who waits, and reaches 1,335 days. Those figures orbit the same 3.5-year span that has surfaced again and again, the time, times, and half a time that measures the tyrant's season. And they line up with the very same period in Revelation, where a dragon pursues a woman into the wilderness, and she is protected there for exactly that stretch. The same clock is ticking in both books, which is the kind of detail that makes you sit up. And there is something quietly moving in that final figure, the extra 45 days, tacked on with a blessing for whoever endures to reach it. Right at the very end, the faithful are asked one more time to simply wait, to hold on a little longer than seems bearable, with a blessing promised to those who make it all the way through. The whole book, in a sense, has been a training course in exactly that. But the single most stunning thing the messenger said comes next, and it is a promise the Old Testament had barely dared to speak so plainly before. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, he said, will awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. There it is, the resurrection, stated openly. The story does not end at the grave for anyone. A day is coming when the dead will rise, and they will rise to one of two destinies. Some will wake to everlasting life, and the wise, the ones who live faithfully and turn many others toward righteousness, will shine like the brightness of the heavens, like the stars forever and ever, and some will wake to the other outcome, to shame and lasting contempt. Two resurrections, two destinations, and no third option. Everyone rises. Not everyone rises to the same thing. It is hard to overstate what a leap this is, because clear, personal resurrection is something the Old Testament had mostly only hinted at, in shadows and fragments, for centuries. The hope that a specific person would one day rise from the dust as themselves, bodily, into a life that never ends, is stated here about as plainly as it is stated anywhere before the New Testament. For a book that has spent so many pages on the grim rise and fall of empires, this is the sunrise. Every tyrant, every furnace, every den of lions, every desecrated temple, all of it turns out to have been playing out the whole time under a promise that death does not get the final say. The grave is not the end of the sentence, it is a comma. And for the faithful, what comes after the comma is life, unending and radiant, in bodies that can never again be thrown to a lion or into a fire. And there is a particular reward singled out for a particular kind of person, one worth pausing on. The wise, the messenger said, will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many toward righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. Notice who gets the stars. Not the conquerors, not the empire builders, not the ones who piled up gold and monuments to themselves. the ones who turned other people toward the truth, who used whatever small influence they had to point others home. In a book where the mighty are forever crashing to the ground, the lasting glory is handed to the humble teachers, the faithful witnesses, the quiet ones who spent their lives helping others find the way. They do not get statues, they get to shine like stars, which last considerably longer than any statue ever has. This lands squarely on the great dividing line the whole of Scripture draws through the human race. Those found faithful will be raised into glorified, deathless bodies to reign in a kingdom that never ends, shining like stars. And the others will be raised to face a reckoning measured by their deeds, and the deciding factor in the end comes down to a single question. Whether a name is written in the book of life, those records we saw opened in the heavenly courtroom. If the name is there, everlasting life. If it is not, then all the achievement and power and self-glory in the world changes nothing. It is the statue and the stone all over again, the same fork in the road the book keeps setting before us, now drawn at the scale of eternity. And here, finally, we can release the spring that has been winding tighter through this entire book, because now is the moment to gather up the hidden thread we started tracking so long ago and let its full weight fall at once. Think back over everything we have watched. 4 young captives arrived in Babylon with nothing, no army, no title, no leverage, stripped of their names and their freedom. And what happened to them? Daniel refused a plate of food and was elevated to rule a province. His 3 friends refused to bow and walked out of a furnace into a promotion. Daniel prayed at his window and rose from a den of lions to honor under a new empire. Again and again, at every regime change, under every king, through every threat, the humble ones who grasped for nothing were quietly lifted higher. That is one half of the pattern. Now set the other half beside it. Nebuchadnezzar boasted on his rooftop and spent 7 years grazing in a field like an animal. Belshazzar mocked God with the holy vessels and was dead before morning. The scheming officials dug a pit for a righteous man and fell into it themselves. Antiochus exalted himself and was driven out in disgrace. And the final contemptible ruler, the Antichrist himself, will magnify himself above every god and then collapse alone at the foot of the holy mountain. Every single proud power in this book, from a drunken king to the last tyrant of history, follows the identical trajectory, up in arrogance, then down, hard. That is the other half of the pattern, and it never once breaks. One law, repeated at every scale, from a decision about dinner to the end of the world. God humbles the proud, and God exalts the humble. It is stitched into the fate of every character, woven through every vision, hidden in plain sight from the first chapter to the last. The captive who said we when he could have said they ends the book being told to rest and rise. The kings who said I and my and mine end it in a field, in a grave, in a pit, at the foot of a mountain. This was never a random collection of adventures. It was a single argument, told a dozen ways about which direction the universe actually runs. And it runs downhill for the proud and uphill for the humble. Every time, without exception, forever. That is the whole book, and it is the whole world, and it has been true since long before Babylon, and will be true long after the last empire has crumbled into dust. And the book grants Daniel himself one last tender word, which is exactly the right note to end an old man's story on. Go your way, the messenger told him, until the end. You will rest, and then you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance at the end of the days. After a lifetime of faithfulness under kings who mostly did not deserve him, after exile and lions and visions that left him sick with dread, Daniel is not given another burden or another prophecy. He is given a promise, and it is personal. Rest now, old friend, and at the end you too will rise, and there will be a place kept for you. The humble captive who spent his whole life being lifted up receives, as his final reward, the greatest lifting up of all, which leaves only one thing, and it is the question the entire book and this entire journey has been quietly aiming at you the whole time. Centuries after Daniel, the very figure he saw arriving on the clouds, the Son of Man, described the day it all comes down to. When he returns in glory, he said, he will sit on his throne and gather all the nations before him, and he will separate them one from another the way a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. The sheep he will place on his right and welcome into a kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world, into everlasting life. The goats he will place on his left, and they will go away into everlasting punishment. It is the hidden thread projected onto the final judgment. The same sorting Daniel watched play out among ancient kings now applied to every human being who has ever lived, proud or humble, statue or stone, sheep or goat. There has only ever been one question, and this is the day it gets answered. And it is worth noticing what the shepherd said that sorting would actually rest on because it fits the thread perfectly. When he described dividing the sheep from the goats, he did not measure people by their power, their success, or the length of their religious resume. He measured them by the small, humble mercies they had shown to the least important people around them, the hungry given something to eat, the stranger taken in, the sick and the imprisoned visited by someone who did not have to. And the sheep, tellingly, could barely even remember doing these things because to them it had just been ordinary kindness, not a performance stage for a reward, which is the humility of this whole book arriving in its final form. The ones lifted up at the very end are not the ones who built the most impressive lives. They are the ones who quietly served, who faced the right direction, who showed mercy when absolutely no one was keeping score. It is the same law that ran through every single chapter, now deciding everything. So here it is, put as plainly as this book puts everything else. Which one are you? When the shepherd calls, do you know his voice, the way Daniel somehow always knew which way to face and whom to serve, even in a foreign land under a hostile crown? Are you a sheep who hears that voice and follows, or a goat who has spent a lifetime listening only to itself? The book of Daniel does not ask you to be powerful or clever or important. Every powerful and clever and important person in it came to a bad end. It asks you to be humble and faithful and to keep facing home no matter what the law says. And it asks you to answer the call while there is still time to answer it before the end of the age arrives, or sooner and more certainly before the end of your own. The clock, as this whole book insists, is always running, and none of us knows exactly how many days are left on ours. And if you want to know more about that final ruler we kept meeting in the shadows, the little horn, the contemptible king, the beast who pitches his tent at the holy mountain and falls, then stay close because the next journey is his. The complete rise and fall of the Antichrist, from where he comes from to how he seizes the world, to the exact way it all comes undone at the end, is where we are headed next. Daniel showed us the outline. Next time we fill it in.